Do you hear me like that? It's loud enough, okay. So, really thank you for the invitation. I first want to say that, first for my English, I'm not an English native speaker. I never studied English at school. I live in America, so if you don't understand my English, you tell me. My accent is pretty strong. And since I live in Germany, sometimes, without expecting that, I swap to German, so tell me if I'm in the wrong language. So I'm a composer. So as Steve said, I studied in Paris with Gérard Grisey in composition and Dalbavi in orchestration, other people. I'm not a researcher in orchestration. And I will tell you how I came to this idea of functional orchestration. The idea was that when you look at most of the treatise of orchestration, Hector Berlioz, Sam Adler, Forsyth, Walter Piston, Casella, they are mostly instrumentation treatises. It means they speak about the instrument, and at the end, subjectively, they speak about orchestration. You don't have a general, verbalized science to orchestrate. You have some books to treat that, but Rimsky speaks about that, but very subjective, with his own, I will repeat a little bit what I said yesterday, in another language. So Rimsky has some rules, but he takes his music as an example. When I studied orchestration, as you know, in France there is a long tradition for orchestration. Marius Constant created this class, like an autonomous class, because he was the first one able to orchestrate travels, so he showed that it was possible to do that. I studied with many people, and most of them were very good musicians, but they were very intuitive. They said here something is missing, and very musical, let's say. And then I studied with other people, with Marc-André Dalbavi, our teacher in Paris Conservatory. And Marc-André Dalbavi was really able to verbalize things pretty intuitively, but verbalizing, which means that we could learn very quickly some concepts. His concepts that I will present were based mostly on perception, on psychoacoustics, or on sort of generalities which works. It's caricatural, but it brings something. And I discovered later I went to Berlin as a composer resident, but a little bit later I was adjunct at the Conservatory of Berlin for orchestration, and I discovered that it was very efficient. And when I arrived at Columbia University, Murray was teaching orchestration, and the students were going after the class of Murray to my class of orchestration, and I could see that in 6 months, with those concepts, they could read very quickly the scores. You will see why. It helps to see quickly what happens in a score. But I continued to teach orchestration the way Dalbavi did, and there was a hazard, which was the German Society for Music Theory, GMTA, organized 5 years ago a big colloquium on timbre, and they asked me to be keynote speaker. I have never been to a music theory conference, so I thought it would be a talk like here. And when I arrived, there were 2,000 people, because 2,500, because all the theoreticians from Austria, Swiss, it's a big thing. It was really perhaps 1,000, I don't know, but a lot of people. What I understood, and there was nothing verbalized, and Dalbavi never published, the student of Dalbavi never published, there is nothing on functional orchestration. So I was obliged to write something on 40 minutes and through some exchanges with some specialists. I remember there was a specialist of Brown who said, I understand a few concepts that, although I am a specialist of Brahms, I couldn't understand. I don't say it's a big thing, functional orchestration, but there is a way to speak about scores. And thanks to Steve McAdams, thanks to Actor, later I had this sort of help to conceptualize a little bit more the things. I asked Dabavi if he wanted to publish something. He said always no, you have to do that. I asked to a few students of Dabavi who are in Spain, France, etc., who they wanted to do that. There is nothing on the matter. And thanks to discussions with Steve McAdams, with Keith Snowden, with Denise Bouliane, with Lasse Torrensen in Norway, with Victor Cordero, we start to have some logical points. This is what I will present today. Some of you know already those concepts, but we try to categorize to make it very scientifically, first so that it works with the concept of Denise and Steve, and also it helps to do. Of course, it doesn't mean that when I compose, I use that. It's not a theory of orchestration. It's not, but it's a way to conceptualize things. And when I teach orchestration, which is a very intuitive way to teach, I'm in a conservatory, I'm not in a university. However, I give those functions and it helps the student to go quicker. This is what I will try to explain today. And what is fascinating with those concepts of Dabavi that I tried with the help of the people of Actor to develop is that we see that the scores from Haydn to today, people think like that when they are a composer without using the word, but we are a little bit like, if we want to be pretentious, like the Paris, like 1722 when Rameau invented the scales, the degrees, although all the composers before, just before, so in the beginning of the 19th century, were already in the tonal thinking of degrees, but without verbalization. So, the functional orchestration, this is the name that we give, has 4 objectives. The first one, this is the isolation and verbalization of universal principles of composition and timbre. Such principles would be, if possible, based on acoustics and psychoacoustics, or on phenomenological observation of Gestalt principles of sound organization. The second function will be the development of general functions to categorize operations on time. Space, dynamic, timbre quality, etc. Or to categorize operation on imbricated elements, textures, chords, etc. Or on articulation between independent elements, successive or simultaneous merging, separation of elements, fades, contrast, dynamic, articulation. The third function is perhaps a sort of extension of the understanding of the instrumentation and to consider the instruments through their possible function within an ensemble in order to better understand the function of the instruments within the ensemble. And the first one is identification, categorization, and improvement of these instrumental functions and their mechanism and how their related techniques have changed through history. So, what is important, what I understood through actors and through the great work that Denise, Keith, Steve are doing, is that it's very important to distinguish functions, techniques, effects, and elements. And we will have 3 workshops, one on functions, the other one on techniques, and the other one on effects. An orchestration function is a category of orchestration principle in order to obtain a perceptive effect through one or more technical operation. It means that a function, this is in a way a sort of musical translation from a composer of what psychoacoustical effect he wants to achieve, what timbral effect he wants to achieve, he or she wants to achieve. And for that, he will use then a technical operation of instrumentation to make that into the music. We first call elements, and so we first call an element. I will go later. The technical operation, this is a precise operation in instrumentation or electroacoustic music applied on one element, which can be objectively observed or applied on a support. And the technical operation depends of a time, of a composer, of a history. And the function is universal and, if possible, atemporal. This is a big difference between function and techniques. I will give a lot of examples. The functional operation, on contrary, is a musical aim. That word aim is from Victor Cordero, and it's pretty true, in order to achieve a particular perceptive or musical effect in applying a technique or ensemble of techniques. So the function is a sort of musical meta-category, verbalized or not verbalized, mostly not verbalized until now, but clearly in mind of the composer, which helps him to choose a particular technique to achieve a particular effect. For example, I want to obtain a merging element from different elements. I want to obtain different layers having different weightings. I want to obtain a contrast on a particular form. I want to obtain a crescendo with different instruments playing together. I want something dry or wet. I will speak about that. To understand that, the best example, the most simple example is crescendo versus crescendo. When you want to do a crescendo with an orchestra, with an ensemble, the classical mistake by beginners is to make a crescendo through the instruments. And you know in the history that most of the crescendi are not made by crescendi of the instruments. You add more instruments, or you have your horns going higher in the so for the function crescendo, you will use techniques which are not crescendi techniques. Another good example, and we will look at that, are all the doubling techniques. I will try to categorize the different techniques. But the doubling techniques have different functions. They have a function of precision, of changing the tempo, of having more bass, of changing the space, etc. So that is a function, and you will use different techniques for that. So now I go to something very intellectual, which I don't use when I teach orchestration, but it was through the work with Keith, Steve, and Dennis that I obtained, I was thinking of that, because it's in our view, and I changed a little bit the categories, speaking with Lasseter and Sen. Actually, now I think we can distinguish 4 archetypes of functional orchestration. I'll reduce really now to 4 archetypes. The first one, this is the functions related to the one musical element or some musical elements but perceived as one element. So either you do something on one single element, or you apply something on imbricated, aggregated musical elements perceived as one element. So you make an operation on chords, on textures, on gestures. That is the first operation. The second one is all the operation. So you have 3 archetypes, you will see. All the operation, 3 or 4, depending of here you differentiate vertical and horizontal, but the second type of operation are operation on several elements perceived as several elements. So it's first, it's all the function of articulation between successive elements, so what you call time fields. Tell me if you change the name. And the second one is all the function related to the articulations of simultaneous instruments. The third one, it was not enough for me with my practice. Because when you orchestrate, when you compose, you do operations on the whole. You add some resonance, you add some weight, you add some whole. And I didn't know how to to name that, and I think it was in a discussion with some of you, perhaps Kit, and I worked for very long in Detmold. Detmold is a conservatory who invented the concept of tonmeister. They have the big school of tonmeister, and now they are part of the project. And I had in my orchestration class a lot of tonmeister, so it's like director artistic, like soundmaster with artistic, with a musical training. And I understood that what we do as a composer is, at the end, the third type of operation is working on the entire music, and I will give some examples. It's what I call the sound mastering operation on an aggregate or perceived elements or the entire piece. And it's why I think here we have a good categorization of the three types of functions. Then, when you go to operation applying on one single element or a group of elements or sound mastering, you can apply on following parameters: on dynamics, space, or on timbre, tone, including frequencies or register. If I take the space, the dynamics, sorry, they refer to all possible instrumentation or operation on dynamic changes, for instance, the realization of crescendi or decrescendi, the writing of climaxes, or the reinforcement of one element. For example, Ravel Bolero is a typical exercise on crescendo. Or, for example, you can make a hierarchization of different climaxes. For example, Brahms. Even in each climax, you have really a strategy, a hierarchization. This climax, we think it's a climax, and in the next one, you will put something so that it's a higher climax. So you are hierarchizing that, and as a composer, you have to think about that. I will give some examples, but I try to go quickly for the intellectual categorization, and then we will go to Schubert. The second types of operation, that is really in the center, in the birth of the functional orchestration, because it's one of the first concepts of Dalbavi. So it's all what is related to space, and Dalbavi starts like that. He speaks about directionality versus unidirectionality of the instruments. It looks pretty caricatural, but it was very important because suddenly it adds a third dimension of thinking the instruments. It's not at all, it's not anymore loud and quiet, or high and low, but it adds a third categorization. So the example that Dalbavi gives, and you see that the composers really relate to that, whatever the period, is you have some instruments which are directional. The oboe is directional. The trumpet, in the classical sense, is directional. Later you could use a mute, etc. But I speak about classical music. Or the real instrument. Later you will think like that with virtual instruments, and we'll speak about that. And you have some instruments which are unidirectional. The horn is louder than the oboe, but is mostly, in the classical music, unidirectional. Of course, later you can put the bell high, etc. And it helps, the flute is unidirectional. The trumpet is directional. And Dalbavi goes so far that he says even the thinking of the first violin versus the second violin is like that. Means the classical composers use the first violin directional when the second violin will be unidirectional. The trombone is directional without muted state. I speak about the classical music. And you can go very far. You can explain why in the Japanese gaigaku you put the percussions in the front, taiko, etc. Then you have the plucked instrument in the middle, and you have the sustained strings, sustained instruments, sho, etc. in the back. Then, when in the Western instrumentation, you use something else. In the geography of the orchestra, interferes on the space as well. Thinking about that, after a few years, I show you. It was very intuitive, but working in Detmold, I had a student who made this curve, which, because the notion of projection is not very scientific, but he did this study, and you see very pretty. It's about the projection. The flute is very little projective in the low register, in the high register, in the middle register. It projects everywhere, projects in the back. when the oboe is very directional. And you see the bassoon, and we'll see an example of the bassoon. The bassoon has a double reed, so we think it's like a oboe, but it's in the middle. And the classical composers will use the bassoon really with both functions. And the clarinet is also in the middle, and as you know, for very long, the clarinet was a sort of horn in the higher register, or for the note that the horn couldn't play. So, after, I think, in the future, what could be interesting to do, if someone wants to develop functional orchestration, is to think the space in a larger sense, is to have three subcategories of space. The notion of location, all those categories work for electroacoustic as well. The notion of location of my sounds, the notion of directionality and projection, where do I am like that or do I am like that, and the idea of space focus. For example, you have a lot of music where you have a sort of cantus firmus, trombone plus horns, and you see that it's differentiated with all the strings playing. It's to have a sort of long thing which is both directional and directional, and we will see with Schubert also a famous example. So then, now to be very systematic, but as a composer I never think like that, of course, but you could see that operation, when they apply to several elements, here in orchestration, what a composer is thinking, or what we do in orchestration, is we have three types of operation. The first one is dealing with or reinforcing the identity. I want something to merge. You will see that in Ligeti music, in Beethoven music, in Debussy, they want one body, so they will use a lot of indirectional instruments. Beethoven has a big problem with oboes, and the oboe is just doing some techniques. Ligeti has the same problem. So it's all the strategies to reinforce the identity of an object. Or sometimes we have another strategy as a composer. We want to reinforce difference. For example, Schubert, 5 pieces for orchestra, he has a contrapoint. He wants really the contrapoint to be heard, each line to be heard. So he will use in each layer some indirectional instrument, but some directional instrument, so that they distinguish from each other. And the third type of operation, this is dealing with transitions. You have a lot of typical transition from making a crescendo to Wagner having a sort of fanfare melody. You know, in a prelude of Tristan, you start in the low register and you go to the high register, and you have to perceive that like one line, although this is different instruments who work, or you can change the color, etc. So it's, I think, the three types of operation we deal with as composers. So, when it's operation on successive elements, then I go a little bit further. We have three types of operation, and I will give some examples. It sounds really abstract now, but it's all about similarity operation. Typically, I have an object, I have another object, or so, for example, in the sonata 4, I have the same object in the B theme in another tonality. I have to do so that it sounds the same. Or I have a climax, or I have a Ravel bolero. I want that two objects sound similarly, and I develop strategies for that. On the contrary, I develop a lot of contrast operations. I have two objects. I have a first theme, second theme. I want them to be perceived like that, and we'll speak about that. So all the strategies to have contrast operations. Is that too loud? It's okay? Okay. And the third one is all the strategies for gradual transitions, and of course you have a lot of strategies for that. So, and here, for simultaneous elements, same thing, we have three types of meta-categories. All the elements to merge, all the elements to segregate. I spoke about Schubert, but also you have all the operations to hierarchize layers. Melody accompaniment, you make a hierarchy of the separation, or you want less or more differentiation. And then you have that, I think the list is not finished, but you have all the sound mastering operation. You have, for example, all the focus functions. You want in a music that will focus on something. You have all the operation on present, but that would be interesting to work with a sound engineer, to develop that. I did that alone, and I think it's not finished. Presence functions, sustaining, resonance, what the sound master used to have a sort of presence through the sustaining. I call that dry wet. When I was starting to teach orchestration in Berlin, I was speaking about source a lot, and when I left Berlin, they gave me a book on source, my students. We don't have the cover right now. It's just to tell you that all is very intuitive, all has to be musical, and we try to translate that into concept. And then you have all the ensemble treatment mastering. It goes very far. Sometimes I say to my students, here you have to write like channel music, even if it's a tutti. But there is a big difference between a tutti writing and a channel music. It means it sounds like an orchestra and it sounds like channel music. The function of the instruments together are not the same, and it doesn't mean that you have the entire orchestra playing or you have just a few instruments. It's a way of writing, so it's pretty still intuitive. So something very important is what I call the principle of tree logic. Once again, it's very caricatural. It doesn't work later, but it helps like directionality and directionality. And it's a principle, I think Dabavi spoke about that already. It's a very important principle in orchestration when you orchestrate. The idea, if you want, is you have to analyze when you orchestrate something or when you compose, you have to analyze all your form, but in a further level than what the theorists do. It means you go until what is in a motive, the question, the answer, asystasis, you go to the accent, you go very, very far. And at the end, it's very important that the contrast between, for example, the first theme and the second theme is more important than the first motive and the second motive, which is more important, here's the contrast, than like that. It's a principle that you have to have in head. And you see that the classics do that all the times. The romantic as well. Mahler, it's more complex, but it's still there. There are two exceptions. I explained that yesterday. I can't go very far today, but first it's Beethoven. Beethoven never applied that, but systematically, I can't explain that quickly here, but the idea is what I call a sort of rhizomatic composition. He has something which will develop to something else, and he wants to work with us. So you will have a theme, and when you repeat the theme, it's another orchestration. Or you will have suddenly you will have an element with directional instruments for the motif and the accompaniment with mostly directional or pedal, and later you will have the pedal with directional instruments and the motif with unidirectional. I will change. It's part of the music of Beethoven, because Beethoven typically, caricature, I could spend hours on that. It's about having an element that you don't perceive, which will become something later. So it's why the orchestration of Beethoven is very, very particular. I asked my students not to orchestrate that, but it seemed interesting to follow that. Another very known example is Schumann. Schumann, when you look at Schumann, he's so much in the detail that he makes a small motif with two contrasts, and that he loses this tree principle. And at the end, you have a lot of small contrasts, but you don't perceive the big form. You have the strings playing almost all the time on the part where it's, for example, take the Renan, where it's not very clear the orchestration. And he doesn't follow that, because he doesn't have it. So it's a principle which is very important for a composer to follow, to have the general. We will see some examples later with and of course in the music, of course after Mahler, the Jeu by Debussy, it becomes more difficult, but it has to be part of the composition. And here I insist on something: you never compose orchestration. Nobody composes effects. it's part of a general strategy of composition, and form and orchestration are together, and we will see that even for Schubert. Okay. Then you have some operation typical of that you know, operation on one element. Here by actors there is a great job of finding a general denomination on that, because each composer uses different denomination. But you have three types. It's caricature of writing that is mostly the classical type, and each period tries to do another sound to differentiate. So superimposed, you have the classical thing. We could speak hours about what does it mean in the detail, where the flute, what's the art, but overlapped with a lot of doubling and interlocked. Of course, you can have the clarity and stuff, but interlocked would be these techniques. That you see, for example, by Berlioz, you see a lot of this technique because he doesn't want to have this classical wind sounds, and Schubert sometimes, and it becomes more complex. I give you, and after it goes, we go to the detail, of course. I give you here an example from Sibelius. Sibelius, it's interesting because it's interlocked, but look at the oboe here. The oboe are above the flute. The flute is inside the oboe. And he uses a lot this sort of technique to have a sort of sound of the winds, which is not this classical sound of the harmony we said by the classical instrument. Each period tries to use this body instrument, which is the orchestra, in a different way, so that it sounds different. Okay. So, operation on one element, you have a lot of techniques. Look, I show you here an example that I showed already. Denise knows that. Of course, I orchestrate a lot of Brahms. Brahms is very interesting for us. It's a master in orchestration. It's a master because he starts very quickly. He doesn't want to sound classically, so he starts to have something, the trilogic principle. All those elements are clear, but the instruments to make the contrast, for example, are not the real instrument, but become virtual instruments. I will explain here with this small example. The typical mistake that many people do when they read the score like that. So they follow the viola and they can't understand. And here, what do you have? You have textures, you have elements which you have to read as a virtual instruments. I will do that with colors. So for example, in terms of trilogy, you have clearly the contrast between that, and it starts again here. So, for example, for the melody, it's two different instruments, even if the violin play, continue to play, but here the instrument is called violin in octaves, which sounds differently. It's one instrument, the violin in octaves, and with the contrast with this violin in solo. And second thing, for example, here it's typical, the instrument making the sort of bass is not a contrabass, but it's a sort of contrabass with a nearization. Means you have a command D here, so you have one sound, and it continues like that, and then the cello continues here, and it continues with the viola. So it's one instrument, and you have to read like that. I think it's clear. And for the accompaniment, if you want, for the harmony with the syncopation, you have to read like that in blue with different layers, of course, later. But here, like that, you see that you can read the score much quicker if you see that as virtual instruments. And now we start with Brahms, of course, the notion of virtual instrument, orchestrating with virtual instrument. So that's why the functions have to be very clear and not thinking in terms of intuition and in terms of your instruments. And you have to have a strategy, let's say. You have to have a strategy of trilogic, you have to have a strategy of which virtual instrument, which sound do you want, and then you orchestrate. I always ask my students in composition never to orchestrate firstly, but to have an idea of I want strings, but it doesn't mean that at the end this is a strings we play. It's sort of what Jean Cavé calls image sonore. You have an image sonore, and then you have thousands of examples. Even yesterday I spoke about the Marche Funèbre. Marche Funèbre, Beethoven had the idea, I want a trumpet and a snare drum. He never used the trumpet, he uses the oboe to imitate the snare drum, but really the imitation with the fourth imitating the. And for the snare drum, he doesn't use the timpani for the entire piece. He uses the contrabass and then the string very slow. Then he has a very clear idea of what he wants, and he will play with that against the expectation. And if you look at the score, I go very quickly, but in the Marche Funèbre it's fantastic because he uses the timpani as for that function. Only at the end, I think it's measured 227, if I remember, or 247, when you have sound. Power. Okay. So you have. So only at that moment you have the timpani playing the timpani. It's really at the end of the piece we understand because before like that, and it goes faster. I speak quickly, but it's Beethoven, of course, using all the surprises of the surprises of the surprises of the surprises. You think, okay, it's a timpani, you can do that, and at the end, with the coda, which is a crazy coda, I don't know, more modern composer, you have this rhythm, which is not a rhythm. And we expect the C, melody, and who plays the C? The timpani. And then he continues contrabass, imitating the timpani. So it goes very, very far. Huh? This idea of I want a timpani and I won't use the timpani as a function. I want a snare drum as a function. So, doubling technique, very quickly. Now, with the time, with my experience, I can categorize the doubling techniques like I think I have 6 types of doubling techniques. Of course, it doesn't mean that when you use as a technique these doubling techniques, it makes only that function, but it's mostly the function related to the doubling techniques. The first one are all the techniques for spectral densification. Typically, I have my cello and I double with the contrabass. I open the bass. This is a spectral densification. I have all the techniques for as a function mostly, and once again, when you put the contrabass, it opens, it reinforces also the dynamics, but the function is spectral. All the techniques for more precision. Typically, cello, and you put the bassoon with the cello. The third one are all the doubling for dynamic amplification that we understand. Of course, one technique will change the timbre as well, but the function will be mostly for dynamic amplification. The fourth one is doubling for space improvements. Typical example by Mozart, you have all the strings playing, and later he repeats and he adds one flute in the second octave, so we don't hear the flute, but it adds a sort of space opening. And with the function of the horn, of course, not as doubling, but you open the space. But you can. Then you have all the question of theme change, but you will see I have a sixth category which is a little bit different. Here I speak about what changes the time. I think it's Steve who speaks like that, perhaps you have a better vocabulary than me. But we still can recognize which instruments are playing. Typically, xylophone plus flute. I hear the flute, I hear the xylophone, I have one compound with another attack, but I know what instruments are playing. And the sixth one, very important, is what Dalbaki calls the mixture. It comes from the organ. It means you have two instruments, or many instruments, doubling, and you don't perceive anymore which instrument is playing. You have an emergence of a new sound. And one of the most famous examples is one of the first example, is what we will see later with Schubert. So here, I will go to this example. We will see that later. Another I don't show that is Schubert, but another example, the dies irae in Berlioz. I give some examples of mixture to see how people are strategically. When it starts, later it becomes more complex. So typical, we think, okay, you remember it's Ophicleide, a sort of tuba, and it will be Ophicleide plus a bassoon as doubling to reinforce. Actually, Berlioz does something which is very, very interesting, just at the beginning, and later it becomes more interesting. He has the tuba, but he has the tuba one at will. He has 4 bassoon and tuba. The tuba are 1 octave higher than the bassoon. Why? You can imagine the sound of it's to imitate the organ. And you obtain really a sort of mixture. You don't recognize that it's 4 bassoon, but you have many instruments types, of course, for the mixture. 4 bassoon and the tuba, it becomes the sound of the organ. So here it's a mixture and not doubling for precision or something like that. And later, as you know, it becomes more complex. It's fantastic. With the timpani, with the with the exactly with the chili, and with the timpani, it becomes one element which is also timely in the time, very complex. Another very known type of mixture, I will go quickly, is trumpet and English horn in an air to imitate the, how do you say in English, the corps de brume? Foghorn, yeah? Foghorn, yeah. And so here it's a mixture. You have the typical ligeti, new sounds having parallelism with wrong octaves, so different elements. You have that by that further too, and you obtain a compound which is makes a new element in the sense of the organ. One other very known example is Bolero of Ravel. It's a mixture. It makes really the quintoiement, the fifth, like in an organ. Another example which is beautiful by Ligeti, chromatic harmonica in C with clarinet, something which is very, very interesting. So, of course, in the new music, you can go very far. Here I give an example of my music. Sorry for that, but it's a long piece. Most of my music has always, you know that, instruments which are not classical. I use classical saxophone, electric guitar, I can't spell. It's my only piece with 5 very classical instruments, so the piano. And my difficulty was, it was for some research, was how can I do so that, of course, there are a lot of challenges using instruments that we know, orchestration challenges to make a diversity of them. And you have 4 movements. The first one is very very active, and the second one is very quiet. And all the 4 movements are all on the visual artist, and the second one is on Jeff Wall. Jeff Wall, I think, is a Canadian photograph, and he takes pictures. And when you don't know, you see the picture. It's interesting, but if you know, it's always in reference to something. And there is a photograph by Jeff Wall where actually he copies a painting by Hokusai. And in this piece, I take a gegaku melody called Etenraku, and I try with the orchestration to imitate a little bit the sounds of the gegaku. Not once to once. So the hichiriki, sort of clarinet, oboe, it's between the piccolo clarinet and the oboe, and the sound of the sho. So here, just to show you what I do, I take the flute, it's a very high register, doubled by the E flat clarinet, and to have a sort of texture, I put 2 strings with hotel mute in the back, doing a glissando of 1/2 tone. And there you will see how it sounds. And I follow the melody of the eternal. Creating something. So you can listen to the and there it is. Okay. So now some example of sound mastering. I go quickly if I want to go to Schubert. I think we are on time. Here I present for me, one of the most famous examples. Sorry, I repeat always. It's the same examples, but I think it's a clear example. So here, it's a composer who wants to do an effect which is quite classical. It's an effect like wow, wow. So you have that by many pieces. Trichord by Fire. So what I advise always with my students in composition, when you have an effect, you have to analyze intuitively. What do I do? What do I do? There is a glissando, going up, going down. There is sort of granulation, and there is a change, crescendo, decrescendo. And generally, you orchestrate, you separate a little bit the tree operation of it. So here you have a composer using the big tutti of the instruments and doing having. So I will show mostly unidirectional instrument in the low register. This is Bartok, Blue Bar Castle. Oh, sorry. Okay, I will go to this example here. Okay, and I will go back to high. So you have all the instruments, the low register, unidirectional. You see the trilogy is commonly respected because you have all the direction instruments contrast a small melody with oboe, English horn, and bassoon. Contrast. And you use the strings, I don't know if you see, very close accords, like Beethoven is much familiar with tremolo to make a noise, with crescendo, decrescendo, so two functions, the granularity and the crescendo, decrescendo. You have the instrument doing the glissando, also with, of course, the crescendo, decrescendo. The glissando and a sort of harmonization of sounds are celesta, so timpani also, not that, so you have mostly two sort of function and the flute. But you have something that Bartok did, and we listen to that, which is incredible. While the flute is doing, the first flute is doing that second octave. So what the flute is not doing, someone has an idea not really clear yesterday. Why the flute stays? Okay, I help you. If I do, I have the mic, but if I do in a resonating room, whoa! I go to a climax and I go back. So what happens in the climax? You have the resonance, you have the whole. Exactly. So you have the high frequency staying, and here he's orchestrating the whole. He's orchestrating, it's a sound mastering operation, he's orchestrating the resonance of this. We will listen to that. It's a Blue Bar Castle. Here's some resonance. Contrast. And it's not the whole, doing this. Okay, so it's a very, very good example. So here I want to do an example which is very, very simple, but you will see that all those composers knew, of course, those principle. We'll listen to that if we have time. Yeah. Just an introduction, introduction of the Symphony system. Just analyze this introduction. Bill, you tell me if the color is wrong. But first, I start with the first chord. Do you think it's normal to write a chord like that? With all the that I did? Look, for example, at the oboe. Where are they? Adoué. Unisono, in the low register, it's forbidden. I've never put in this register. Why did I? Is it a mistake? But if you look, everything is like that, wrong. The flutes. When you write chord, a classical chord, it's like that. You put the flute in the third octave, you open your chord in the classical music, you open your chord, you put the oboes here. The strings are fortissimo, and however, the chord is not open. It's all in unison, double strings, so I think he knows what he does. Double string on the D. So of course he wants that, he wants this sort of ugly sounds, anti-orchestrated at the beginning, anti-orchestrated, like that, to open. Like, you know, the fourth chord in the classical music is very important. So all the rules are wrong, let's say, but with purpose, and it's very consistent. Then you have a classical structure, so will you tell me if it's okay? So let's say here's the first statement, it's just an introduction, first statement. 1, 5, and then contrastement, 5, 1, or I don't know, 5, 1, he repeats, and then he has a sort of answer, a sort of continuation with the B to T, and then he goes to the Neapolitan, he repeats 1, 5 on the Neapolitan, 5, 1, and then B to T going to something else. If you look at the orchestration, it's very, very structural. First violin solo, 2T of the strings, then he repeats first violin, 2T of the strings, first violin, 2T of the string, and here he does exactly the contrary. 2T of the strings with the animation with the, it goes always faster with the 2T of the strings, violin solo, 2T of the strings, violin solo, and go to here, okay, and so antecedent consequent, and the continuation lead to T, written perfectly clear, the harmony with the winds, the strings play the accompaniment in the melody, so the functions are very different. You see the flute is written in the third octave, and the leading, the sensible is going there, the oboe are perfectly written, and you have that. And it goes back, same sound, only the strings, and the tutti. What is interesting, here I have the Neapolitan, is I wanted you to look at that. What is he doing here? This, that's I open my chord. Generally, what is doing the person? Which function is doing this? Which degree is it in the Neapolitan? Oh, 5. It's a typical function. You answer, you put a little bit of a weight. It's typically the function of a horn. You have very, very often in certain music, when you have only the string or so many instruments playing, you put fluidity with a pedal of horns. But of course, we are in the Neapolitan. The horn can't play the notes because of the natural horn. So it puts a lesson. So it thinks function of the horn, the exact note what we do a horn solo to put a little bit of source. It puts the lesson. So you see, just to see with this very, very simple example, so the first one, that they respect the classical rules of they think in terms of functions. And they think in terms of virtual instruments, in the sense it's a horn that plays the bassoon. Okay. So, here it's an example of texture in my music. But texture with a crescendo. And everything has to merge, but it has to be, for those who know my music, there is no counterpoint, there is no surface. I play in between with 20 still, I don't know, sometimes more rhythmical, but here with the orchestration, I obtain, of course, I am with some techniques of composition, I obtain a texture which moves and which goes to a crescendo. Okay, so here, to finish, and we go now to Schubert, and perhaps we have the question at the end after the Schubert, it's okay? We'll continue? Or we have a few questions now, but if it's short, we go to Schubert, or something which was not clear? Okay? So we go to. So, what is very important is that when you think in terms of orchestration, you have to differentiate the aim, what does the composer want, from the technique. Which techniques, composition, instrumentation, does he, she apply for it to obtain the function? And this is where we have to differentiate that. The composer do always that. It's not verbalized, but it's in. Second point, and now I go to Schubert. I think you have all the scores. You have the scores with you? Okay. Of course, you have an aim, but people don't compose the orchestration. The orchestration is not an objective in itself. And we'll see, even for Schubert, I choose Schubert because it's very easy, it's very simple, it's a start. In 1 hour, I hope to have enough things to say, but you will see that he has a function, and through this function, through this objective, he will have some strategies, and the strategy will be some technique of orchestration, but sometimes it will be some techniques of composition. Form and timbre are related, and you can't dissociate one on the other. So, I start, perhaps I go to the score, but you have the score. I take mine. You have the measure number, huh? You have all the. But you have the score. The PDF is not very beautiful here, because we have also that. So, you have a first theme, a second theme, and the second theme. First, what would have done the classical composers, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, if you had a theme like that and an accompaniment of that? Which sort of instrument would have played the first theme and the accompaniment? Something similar. Yes?
First violin would have played that beautiful T.
Yeah.
Accompaniment winds probably, and something like that.
Exactly. That could be a possibility, and if we invest knowing that in the second theme, the melody is done by the strings and the accompaniment by the winds, you see, by Schubert, it's very logical. The third theme will be melody with the winds, accompaniment with the strings. Second theme, melody with the strings, accompaniment with the winds. So if we think, okay, we have already the strings for the melody in the second theme, which sort of instrument could do the melody and which sort of instrument could do the accompaniment? But Denis said, of course, it's the string, but if it was a wind playing the melody, it would be a. Which instrument plays the melody by the classical, which wind instrument is directional, so to play the melody, it would be a oboe. It would be oboe. Thank you. And the strings, which instrument will do the ta 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 ta? Which instrument will play the accompaniment? Which strings will play the accompaniment? If it was
It would be a role for viola.
viola, or viola, if you have two lines, it will be viola and second violin.
Yeah.
Who plays the melody? And it's really very known example of who plays the melody. You can look at the score. Oboe and Klein. What
Virtual
type?
saxophone.
Exactly. It sounds like saxophone. So it means it's a doubling. Which sort of doubling is it? It's a.
Emergent timbre.
It's exactly. It's mixture. It's emergent timbre. You have the emergence. You don't recognize who played that. You have clarinet and oboe sound like a saxophone. So now, it's why the orchestration is not about finding the elements only like that. It's about having strategies. He thinks, okay, I do sort of geographical surprise. I have my accompaniment and I have my melody coming from the back with a sound we don't know what it is. So, who plays the accompaniment here? I don't speak about the beginning with the cello and contrabass, but who plays the accompaniment? Which strings play the accompaniment? And why? Which instruments play? Of course, in a register which doesn't cover the melody, but who plays the accompaniment?
First and second.
First and second violin. Is it normal? No. So why is he doing that? Because of course, he wants to surprise with the new sound, so he has this classical for that time, classical etudes, an introduction, and he wants people to think, that is my theme. That is my motif. When you have the first strings playing something, you think, that is interesting. So you see already, it's very simple here, but we are in the thinking of strategy of surprise, of surprise, of surprise. Because later you have this question, it's the only reason why he uses the first violin and second violin to make the accompaniment. Second, and you will see that in this piece, for me, the mixture is really, the notion of mixture is in the center of this project. It's really a piece on, for that time, on new timbre, new techniques of orchestration, new playing techniques, and you want to show that it's really almost pedagogical. So, you see the general structure. We have accompaniment with the strings, but it's beautiful game with us. The melody later with the winds, and when you have the second themes, contrary, remember, it's cello playing the melody with clarinet and viola, and then it's bassoon, clarinet, and so you have the inversion, the clear inversion, the trilogy on the broad aspect is respected. You have the big contrast between third theme and second theme. So I will go a little bit chronologically because the form is very simple, and I think Bill will go in a more detailed form. Go to the measure 20. So you have the theme starting. And then you have a signal, you have a sort of accent. So, measure 20. So we put it's clear, huh? What happens in this accent? It's a huge accent. First, don't read on the notes. What happens is, for the first time, you have a big instrument of the bass. An instrument arco is not an instrument in the beats, and suddenly you have those bass having this accent. And you have in the high register, so it's a harmony. It's interesting because here the score is transposed.
The trombone is missing. The F sharp.
No, but the horn is written.
They're in C.
Yeah, okay.
But the trombone F sharp is missing. I'm sorry.
Yeah, but in the original score. In the original score, it's because it's in C. Yes, I tell you don't have the score in. I will find the score with natural, not transposed. It's important because when you read the horns, you understand the horns through the overtones. So, sorry, I open all my. It's very important to. Okay, I think I have a Schubert here. So I show you in the original, it's the same verse. Okay. So the same. I have two versions. I have the Markov and the.
That's the one that I'm using.
Yeah. I bought because of you, because my score is this one, but it's completely, it's completely. I use the EMD, but it's okay. So I show you the what he does here. Very important. Here, the accents. So it's with the horns, and direction instrument in the high register, and of course he goes in the high register of the horn. That's why it's very important to understand the functioning, to read the horn. I ask my students to always orchestrate with natural instruments, transpose but to see, because a horn, this is like all the natural instruments, they are thought like the timpani. It's 5-1 if you want. It's not. And you have many scores by the timpanis, whereas you are in D major, but the right G, C. And the things are like overtones. You have some pitches which are playable. So you see he's on the 9th and 11th overtone of the horn, of the natural horn, and he has B. It's very important to think, very modern at that time, he uses, he jumps from one overtone to the next one. It doesn't change, of course, it doesn't have any value. And he has exactly the effect that he wants, which is natural, but the horn is in the high register, and look at the rhythm for T, you stem the dissonance, T, It's very natural, it's very natural. So, that's the horns. Remember the signal because it's important. Arco and horns like that. Then you repeat the theme with a sort of counterpoint with this effect, with this directional or unidirectional horn that's in the high register, so you hear it. It's very beautiful. And second times, typically a crescendo, when you have a crescendo, you have to identify the layers, and each layer has to go further. So what does he do in this crescendo? Here, he uses more strings, here more arco. So automatically, he needs, so you have a crescendo with two steps. The second step starts here, arco with much more basses, so that is okay. So it doubles the melody with direction instrument, and you see it's a technique which you find a lot at the classics where either you identify each layer with different projections, some are direction, some are direction, but you have also the contrary, it means you use mostly the oboe. One oboe will be in one layer, the other oboe will be in another layer, and each layer will be balanced. So this is what it does. It means one oboe is doing the melody, the clarinet also, the bassoon. So you have four layers if you want, the accompaniment, the strings, the melody, and the harmony done by flute plus one oboe. So he opens the contrapunts in the direction instruments are in each layer if you want. So, step 2 of the crescendo, and step 3 of the crescendo is this big accord here. Pam pam, written very classically, classical tutti. Everything is really open. Oboe is the right register. You start always by writing with the oboe. Flute above the third octave. So superimposed, here, he uses the mixer with superimposed. Open. The brass are written correctly. You have the trombone, timpani with the trumpet, etc. So it's a classical fortissimo tutti accent by the classics already. And he uses it. What is interesting is what he does just after this accent. He has, once again, it's T, 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 but since it's a crescendo, he has the same signal written more. So you will have the horn playing this high overtone, and he uses the clarinet. Sorry, I jump always. He uses the clarinet and the horn, the two-direction instrument, doing P, P, P in one, in octavation. It means same signal written in another dynamic. You have to have the same principle and written more. So clarinet, horn this time, the two-direction and direction instrument written more. And then he repeats again. So we are measure 31. You repeat that. And you have, once again, the bit tutti. And you finish. So now you have this bridge, so-called bridge, going to the second thing. The bridge is just one note. Bill, you will tell me if, in terms of musicology or later, these terms are relevant. The bridge, remember? I played wrong rhythm here, and when you sing, you have this part. You have the tendency always to make it here. Tell me if I go too fast, if you can find the measurement. We always sing that too short. It's very strange because it's not Pa, 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 pa. It's much more longer. Da, pa. It's 3 measures of this D. Why is he doing that? Who is playing this D? And what happens? Who is playing this D? Which instrument plays this D?
Bassoons and horns. Bassoons and horns.
How many bassoons, how many horns?
2 bassoons, 2 horns.
So it's not a precision doubling. 2 bassoons, 2 horns in unison, it's more than a precision. It's something strange. 2 bassoons in unison plus 2 horns. What does he want to do? And it's why it's blind. Right? Look at the end. It's once again, it's a mixture, sort of mixture. And what does he do here? He has this mixture. He makes us waiting. Look at that sound, my sounds. I have this mixture. You don't know what it is. And I open and I separate the instruments. Ah, it's 2 horns and 2 bassoons. So it's okay. So here we have really, once again, we are in the center of this project. Look at my different mixture. Like a composer, I mean, you look at my different mixture. Then we have the second theme, inverter, viola, but with, what I think, winds play the accompaniment, strings play the melody. Very often, this thing winds, but they have not the winds alone, they have winds plus viola or winds plus beats to something like that. But they think inversion of the function of the degree, the melody will be done by the strings, the cello in the middle higher register, and syncopation with winds, even if you have the viola. Later, when the violin makes the melody, he reinforces with this beautiful echo of the horns, 2 direction instrument on 1 note. Doing that. Until now, it's okay. We go to 63. Here. Here, once again, he wants to show his modernity. I want to do something which doesn't exist, it's a new technique. What happens? You have how many layers do you have for? So it's a sort of crescendo in, let's say, in terms of orchestration, 2 steps or 3 steps. So it's big. Yeah, here you see this. 1 step is here. 2 steps is when you have a more classical superimposed orchestration with the flutes in the 3rd octave, the oboe, the rotary steps, and the others. You have still a granulation going up, but you open the cork. But here, it's a very strange sound. How many layers do you see here in terms of functions of composition? How many layers? Target. How many functions? What does it mean? I have here, you have the melody, and you have the granulation. Okay? The melody, is it written classically? Not that one, the melody. Who plays the melody?
It's very low.
Very loud, but it's classical. Low. It's very low, and it's classically written. This is what interests me. Now,
This is the lowest rate of the winds, which normally are not used for such and forte.
exactly. And I go further. How many oboes? We start always with oboes. It's directional instrument. Oboe in the low register. How many oboes play that? Forbidden. 2 oboes in the low register, plus 2 flutes, plus 2 clarinets, plus. So, it's like the harmony. It's a big mixture. It's this sort of sound which is low but also two oboes, when we say it's forbidden, it's not forbidden, but it's because of the intonation, the directional instrument, the intonation, like oboe plus trumpet. You have part of intonation, Guillaume knows that. So two oboe plus two clarinet, he wants to create a new sound which will be very closed, very almost vulgar. We don't know what it is. It's a mixture with a sound which is new. And same thing for the graduation. Everything is very low, and to accentuate this closeness, we said, he has the tremolo. So it's all closed, all like a mixture. I create a sound that you don't know what it is, and I will open my sound, and I will put something on. Okay?
Semantically, one could, people describe it as a rough. Dark and rough.
Yeah, rough, exactly. Dark and rough. Very good, thank you. Dark and rough. Huh? Look, you are on the upper string with tremolo on the G here. He used everything to have dark and rough, fortissimo. And he opens, and suddenly you have this tremolo, it's still tremolo, it's still a sound which is very theatrical or operatic on that, and he opens, and he obtains. I open my sound like in the bridge, and I obtain my orchestra which goes to something more classical. And what I do, exactly like in the first theme, I open more light, big tutti, and I orchestrate a sort of resonance, a sort of answer, staying on the dissonance. Blam, 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 blam. You remember the horn with da, 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 da. Blam. I don't think the right pitch, but pim, 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 and ti, pi. What do? I have my big tutti. I use sort of geographical echo. Big tutti, I go into the winds. But what is the difference between only the winds here and only the winds here? Here with the dissonance and the resolution, what disappears? Which sort of winds? In terms of function? Between that, you have only the winds. So you have the big tutti. Very good. The directional disappears and instead the two unidirectional. Okay? So big tutti, the color of the winds, and you make change the focus to B, typically. And here we have something very interesting. He's strategical, like all the very good composer. We have the echo on the winds. And he makes a fade in and fade out with a new element, which is here. The winds will be there, the string starts something. A new music. An element coming from the second theme. We have the line with an element from the second motif. It starts only with the string, to have the segregation, the difference between here and here. And he makes a three-step crescendo. Three-step crescendo, it means it starts here. Second step. When you have three steps for a crescendo, when you do a discrete crescendo, very important, each layer has to have the cue, not only the melody. You make the similarity through the hierarchization, and you have to have the same balance in the three layers and the same operation. So, what does he do? Here, he uses the principle. The melody is a sort of exchange. Low, high, low, high. Second step, he uses this echo that he had there. So, for the melody, he increases, and if you go to the trilogy, it's A, B, A, B. The A becomes bigger, he adds the contrabass. The B, the answer, he goes one octave higher. So, more in terms of the layer of the melody. In terms of the accompaniment, here you had only the directional, unidirectional instruments, which were belonging to the other thing, but he used that as a harmony, as a function of the accompaniment, the harmony. He puts the directional again, and some third layer will be a sort of rhythmical element with the trombone and the, I think it's the horn here. Okay, and very well written, flutes in the third octave, oboe, superimposed, so mixture, sorry, clarinet and oboe, very well written. So second step of the element is logical. And you go to the third step of the element. I have a PowerPoint that I made. So here you have the decrescendo of what was before, but you use that as the figure. What we said, that belongs to the last element in terms of successive thing, but you will use that as a harmony. You have this answer. Second step, you open, you have the melody, the harmony, the melody with the sing, you open, more bass, one octave higher, and you have a third element which is sort of rhythmical punctuation, the first things, and the third one, third step of the crescendo, he goes further, same balance between the three layers, same idea, like Ravel volume, you have just to increase the all elements same thing. So you have in red the melody, still the strings, he uses the harmony, and he adds the bassoon adwood for the bass. He doesn't do anything for the high string, but it's fortissimo this time. And he uses the third element, which was this rhythmical thing, becomes one virtual element, which is syncopation. Pam, 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 pam. It's in blue, so it's why you have to read in terms of virtual instruments. You have the harmony, the syncopation, the harmony, the syncopation. And what does it do? When you have in the low register, the harmony, in the low register of the melody, the syncopation will be in the high register, it's flute and oboe, and the harmony will be in the low register of that, so it's trombone and horns. And when you go to the high register of the LD, if you want, high register, the syncopation goes to the low register, it becomes trombone and horns, and a clarinet, so directional and unidirectional, and the harmony goes in the high register, it means oboe and flute. So it's why here never read like that, but you see the virtual instrument, you have the clarinet, you have all the instruments playing two different elements. Is it clear? And it's very, very systematic. When the melody is low, the syncopation is high, to have a differentiation principle with every time it's in blue and it's directional and unidirectional. And for the directional and directional to have a sort of solution, and we have a very clear structure. Okay, and I will go further. So, last principle, which is a very classical principle. So I go to measure, for example, 95, something which is, no, 99, sorry, 99, but 95 already, 96. A very clear principle also that you have by the classics, except Beethoven, for the same reason I will say, because he wants to play with us. When you have a contrapuntical effect, a stretto, fugato, etc., you always, very often, 90% of the case, you have a pause before the entry of the instruments. So that we hear on that. And here, this is what happens. You have, so it starts with entry, bassoon and cello, so the precision in 95, precision doubling, and he enters flute solo. It's very, very difficult to play, so it's why he has only the 2 violin and he writes pianissimo. Then the oboe, which will be clearer. Then you have clarinet and viola. You see all the time things also in terms of directional and indirectional. He has these different entries, always the rest before, and he thinks, okay, I add more and more, and my oboe is alone, my clarinet and my viola, my 2 unidirectional instruments, will be together, expect the sound, and I open. And he had that also before, but you see the rest, for example, in 100s, the viola stops, and you have a rest. Look at 99, when the oboe starts in 100, in 99, there is a small rest before. And that you find that every time, yeah?
Just one thing. There's, of course, peculiarities. The flute is much less directional in low range. The higher it gets, the more directional it becomes. That goes for the clarinet also. So especially when he jumps the flute at an octave, it becomes a directional instrument at that high range.
Yeah.
Same for the clarinet. So that the oboe remains directional almost throughout, but the flute becomes more directional in the top.
Yeah.
So that's very clever. Use that very precisely.
Exactly. So I don't call that directionality because if you look at but you're very clear. It's about presence.
Yeah.
But, because if you look at the curve of, but it's why I say always flute in the 3rd octave. The 2nd octave is a weak octave. It's even weaker than the 1st octave. So when he wants to project, to have more presence, he will go to the 3rd octave. And that's why I said the B2T before, when you have the sensible or everything, it starts above the C. The C is really important. When we learn at the beginning to have a writing of the chords, superimposed chord, classical, so it's not very difficult. But if you have a chord in C, so 5-1 in C, you won't write the same way in C and in D, because above the C in German, above the C it sounds differently. In the 3rd octave, the flute has more presence than the, and you will see when you have a tutti forte, they will try to have always in the, and you're completely right, here it's in the 2nd octave, so the weak octave, so it's not very present. So it's why the strings, Guillaume, who plays the strings very, very slow, very, very quiet, so that we hear the string. So, and I go to 105. 105, once again, he shows up, very long notes, there is no music. I do a mixture with two oboes, it's not 2 oboes plus 2 clarinets, and the horns, 2 horns, 1 octave lower. I create a new sound with these 3 instruments. So this is, we saw the most important moment, perhaps in the development. There are a lot of things to say in the detail, but here we speak about functional extension, and I want discussion. I go to 154. So, classical. You see? Classical tutti, of course, orchestrated very creatively with the tremolo, but superimposed, very open, flute in the 3rd octave, superimposed, flute in the right register, P, P, P. Second step, echo, pa, pa. He goes perhaps 1 octave lower, but he has no direction instruments. Pa, 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 po. It's Russian. And here, you have something which is very Mozart. So, but you see, it's a typical effect. You remove the directional instrument. And he starts again, he continues again, even always with more. Here you have also in 162, he has all the brass. You see, he has the trumpet. And he removes, when it's all unidirectional, he removes the oboe and the trumpet. So more and same logic. Okay? And then you have the typical cantus firmus with the trombone. That is very modern, of course, for that time. You have the accompaniment of the strings, and you have the trombone, straight trombone, doing. So I'm 176, with a sort of question answer. It means three trombone doing the melody, and the answer will be all the winds. And here it's what is called a group orchestration. Each function, at that time it's mostly group orchestration. Each function is made by a different group of instruments, strings, winds, etc. Of course, later, if you look at brass, I hope in your composition you don't do only that. You go. So I will stop here. I want just to show you something which is very interesting in this score, which is so known, but still I have one question to Franz, and I called him, but he doesn't want to tell me why. It's 319. I asked many people, and they don't know. 319, it's the horns. You see, 320.
With the pedal E.
Yeah.
Okay, that's 320.
320.
21.
321. 320. Ah, you don't have on the score. Okay, I will try to show here.
Well, you can have it online.
Yes, sure.
Yeah, I will show you here. Here. Where is it?
321.
Yeah, here I have no.
The help.
Yeah. One moment. It's just I have to find. Because it's very, very important. Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yep, it's there. Lower. There it is.
Here.
At the bottom.
Yeah. Here.
Yeah.
Okay. Here. The E doesn't exist. The E here with natural horn. This one exists because in the bass clef you read above. So it corresponds written to this here. So fifth harmonics. But this one doesn't exist. I asked many hornists how do they do. Of course, the hornists are not used with natural horn. One said, perhaps 1822. In 1816, Schubert wrote a piece for tenor, piano, and horn, where he uses a horn with two valves. So perhaps he used a chromatic horn, but I don't think. Because it's the only example where you have to do something with a chromatic horn. It's clearly written for natural horn from the beginning through the end. Every note is with natural overtones, so you have the features of the natural horns. He uses even the effect of T-P-P, it's really for the natural horn, playing with overtones. Second movement, I looked at. So I think it's a mistake. And you find in some, for example, Eroica, third movement of Beethoven, you have a low A flat written fortissimo. So it doesn't exist, but of course it exists. It's a G and it's written fortissimo. So you overblow, you say in English, you overblow the G and sounds a flat. It's an effect. And I'm always shocked that today you play normal E flat. It has to be a saturated sound. Beethoven wanted that. So it's very important to have this culture of the natural horns to play right what they want. So you have already on that time a lot of effect, but here it's unplayable. So I think it's a mistake. But later you have all those mixture, once again, with that. And I just look, we go to the, here too you have the classical entry with pause before, and we go to the last chord. we have to the last. We go to the last chord. What is the last chord? It's like the beginning. It's not motive in terms of motif. It's not interesting. It's just one chord orchestrated very low on a B pedal, tremolo, rough, tremolo, with a lot of doubling, flute in the weak octave at way, plus the two oboe, plus one clarinet, the other clarinet like that. So, how you say in English? Not superimposed, but overlapped. Overlapped. A lot of mixture. It's one mixture to say, even my last chord, it's a sound which is new. So, I show you my project. I want in this piece a lot of mixture, and I want a lot of creation of new sounds. I am in terms of new playing techniques, let's say new sounds. It's a sort of demonstration of what you want. So this was my short analysis of that movement in terms of functional orchestration. Yeah.
Just for that horn at 321, I mean, what? How did you figure that out at that time? Because those sounding as sharp is not possible in D horn.
320.
The horn, the octave E written E, just mentioned. It's not labeled on the natural horn.
321.
Yeah, the
A, the written A. Because you.
The E.
Yeah, but.
Because it's not playable on a horn in D. Absolutely not.
No, but on my score in 321, you have two horns playing an A.
Okay.
A. So it's
instead of E, because it's horn in D.
You speak about 321. I would find.
Yeah, the one we just had before.
Yeah, they all play a H. If I am on the right score, you see, it's a pedal of H. Okay, H of B. Sorry, I said German. It's where you are.
No,
the example
page
you
17, bar 321.
No, it's not labeled. The E, yeah, it doesn't exist. The high one, it's what I said. I think it's a mistake.
Yes.
The high E exists, but the low
too high. It's up too low. An octave high would work.
Yes, it means the high E is possible because you read in bass clef. So you read. I have not anymore, but it's this E in treble clef. But the other one doesn't exist. This E doesn't exist.
That's the old problem of D transposition in bass clef, because it transposed up. But now in that case, it would be an octave plus one tone.
Exactly.
So that's a mistake.
No. On that case here, it's just one tone higher.
Yeah.
And when you read in treble clef, it's 1/7 below.
Exactly.
So it's this E will be in terms of overtones, and it doesn't exist. You have the G, which is the third overtones. You have the C, which is the second overtones. But this one doesn't exist, so I think it's a mistake. It's what I mentioned.
Yeah.
And when I ask hornists, professional hornists, my colleagues in horn, they say, yeah, so we don't know. It's true that in 1916 there was this piece, but so he knew the valve chord, but here it's typically not, because the entire piece is clearly written for that horn. It's why I mentioned that. I think it's a mistake. So, thank you. Do you have any question, comments for the entire thing? It was a little bit long and short of the same way. I choose the Schubert because it's, of course, simple in 1 hour. If you go to Brahms, it's 10 minutes. And even you have more. But you understand what I call functional orchestration? Any comments, any questions?
Well, I'm curious about the horn signal, the FE, that's in the, FE is the written version.
Yeah.
As opposed to the It's such a curious thing, because I guess the first note will have to be something close, because it has to be lowered by about a quarter tone. And the soft note is open. So it's almost the opposite of what I would think.
It doesn't close.
Open, close.
No, it doesn't close. It's all open. Mm-hmm. It's 11.
11/10, right.
11/10. So it jumps off one overtone.
But doesn't there have to be some handwork to bring down the?
I don't think, because to have the F instead of to correct the F.
Make it like
slightly, but it doesn't change the sound. It's not stopped.
It's not stopped.
Small, of course. Of that type, they did that automatically. They did that with the mouth. and a little bit with the hand to change. They can do that. It's so high. They can do that with the mouth to adapt the hand. In any case, the hornists, the natural hornists, were very used to have the right intonation because the horn is not right. So the 11 is wrong.
I'm just thinking it's an interesting change because you expect the closed part to be on the soft note.
Yeah,
that has to be the loud note.
It's wonderful because it's. I think they do that, and they have the feeling that just it's very easy to have one overtone of difference. It's so natural because it goes with this idea of waves. It's it plays with the music and with the mouth, and it's why I used clearly the horn. He was thinking, okay, I go to the Orchestral. It's not difficult in the Orchestral to go from one overtone to the next one, and he has the natural wave with the body of the instrument. That's why it's a fantastic example of using the horn like it is in the Orchestral. It's not a pedal. It's not a. I go to a harmonics which is difficult, like you said. It's not the F. It's wrong. So T and it's tense. So I tense my F to adapt that, and I go back to something I know. E. So the dissonance is also in the playing. Yeah.
This question of playing notes with the hand, this is a very interesting thing. There's a very nice example at the beginning of the fourth movement of Berlioz' Fantastique, when Berlioz says, "Do not play with the valves.
Yeah.
Make the chromatic note with your hand, because you want to have this rough and dark sound."
Yeah.
Nowadays, everyone plays that with the valve. It's too clean.
Yeah.
It's too clean. If you like pop, pop, the timbre changes a lot.
Yeah.
If it's played the way Berlioz wants,
Exactly.
it makes a big difference.
You find a very interesting table in the treatise of instrumentation of Berlioz. He has a table of all the pitches where you do half close, etc., and which effect it is. Unfortunately, when Strauss translated the treatise in German, you remove that, of course, because Strauss, he wanted to defend, his father was hornist, he wanted to defend the chromatic harp. But if you take the French version, I don't know if the English version exists, if it's a Strauss or, but he has this big table, this huge table, with all the pitches that you can do with that. And like you said, Berlioz, for example, Berlioz, so Symphony Fantastique, as you know, is this is a young Berlioz who wants to do like Beethoven, have an equus conducting, etc. So you have a lot of quotations from Beethoven. Seine-Chant is the pastoral, etc. And I mentioned the A flat, fortissimo, low F flat, written low F flat, fortissimo Beethoven. And Berlioz uses also the low F flat fortissimo to do like it's a new technique of that. But you're right with the hands. But it's when I say it's half closed, it doesn't change so much. It's not like it's not like D, for example, here. D by Berlioz, it doesn't exist by Schubert. D here, E flat is okay, it's half, and D is really close. And what you have a lot by Schubert, and you see here a lot, not in this second, but he writes a lot of A written A here. Because A and B flat, in any case, they have to correct. Because it's between A and B flat, 7. But here you go to the 11, 10s, and 10. More comments also about the functional orchestration. Does it speak to you for who is the student here in composition or in orchestration? Okay. Does it speak to you also when you compose, this sort of thinking in terms of functions? No.
Well,
Or comments or discussion? Yeah.
I really like the fact that we can be aware of directional and it's like very straightforward instrument as well as
It's when
directional.
When Lévy had this concept, it's very simple. Simply you read the classics, you read, it works. I remember when I was teaching orchestration at Columbia, beside composition, I had in my class 1 year critics of the New York Times, musical critics of the New York Times, who came, and she told me after, when she hears the concept, she hears also differently because she sees automatically who is directional, who is undirectional. And it's one function. It means later here I took examples where the directional are real instruments. But of course, when you compose later, this is the same functions in terms of virtual instruments. So you have to think all these functions. I show an example of the horn played by the bassoon. But I think what will be directional, or what will be open in the space, what will be there, what are my hierarchy, what is this? Everything has to be in terms of virtual instruments. So you have to compose a sort of meta piece. There's a lot of sketches for the piece, but even before orchestration, even if you have a clear idea of who plays what, you take time. This is a method of computer, I call that step 1, step 2, step 3. Take time, step 2 is the sketches, and step 3 is so I go shortly. Step 3 is the right decision. You take time. When I do, for example, the Brahms, we do, of course, weeks of Brahms, but if you look, I start always with the fourth, last movement with the variation, because this is where you have less formal strategy. Although, even in the variation form, each variation has a very clear strategical moment. The variation before is with that type of an instrumentation or that type of texture, which creates either a contrast or progression to the next one. So you have to analyze that, but it's clear, your section. And there is one variation which is very simple, when you have only the string, or only the strings. You think, no. And if you look in detail, the viola is above the first line. It means here too, you have Brahms who thought, okay, I want the string here, it's very simple. I do something which is where I play against the instrumentality, against the first step, that I go to the first step, against the normal. And all the composers do something against. So it's why the technique that they use, you have to go really in the detail to see how they create sound which don't exist for them.
The range idea is very important. Of course, Brahms took that from Haydn, which is pitch-driven dynamic. This is exactly the concept of Haydn. Haydn has very few indications, piano forte, but he writes in a range where he knows it's going to work. So, a lot of examples, the viola goes over simply because you want to make sure that it's going to come through with more intensity. That's quite interesting. So, yeah, that's something which Haydn is a master of. Actually, very underestimated. The orchestrator Haydn. There's a lot one can learn from him.
The body,
I cut something out of my script, but I'd like to bring it back in here. I didn't feel like I had time. We go to the very beginning, because your comments completely explained something to me that I didn't understand before. So this is in bar 9. So in my own analysis, I have written here that it's a thematic introduction, because we think the tune is really the da, dee, da, da, da. But when you first hear it, you're not necessarily sure that it's a thematic introduction. First of all, there are a lot of notes there, but because it's being played by the first violins, our tendency is to think, well, maybe that's thematic right from the very beginning. And in fact, in bar 10, he brings the A sharp, B, C, da, 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 dee, da, 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 dee, da, 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 dee, which turns out to be a little motive from the melody that come in. So the confusion as to whether this is a thematic introduction or if it's really the real beginning is totally complemented by the orchestration that you choose that clarified that. Actually.
And I read that that part was completely modern at that time, having a sort of introduction, melodic introduction, already very melodic and melodic. So already that is very surprising. I think what that, it sings, it's melodic, and just a sort of small thing here, also a sort of very clever thing. He goes until the C sharp. Of course, he's a clever composer, and he says, aha, it's a C sharp. So when I go to the development, you remember what he does? He goes to the C natural. C natural, open string, it's really a world. You remember at the beginning of the development? Here. And it goes, and to increase that effect, C natural, both open string with tremolo. You have that just 1/2 tones. So all is very strategic. Yeah.
The nice thing about that so-called introduction is that many composers like Gluck or Mendelssohn would have used it that way, that would be it. But no, this is the main material for the development. He doesn't use P1 into the development. He uses only the introduction. That's very good.
I actually call it the main theme.
It can be considered that way because of its use.
Because of its use.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's
And it's
very, very
repeated
good.
with lots of
Because many composers have done that slow introduction before the title. But this material is just introduction.
Yeah.
Now that's the core of the piece. And we were led completely astray with two beautiful thematic units. And then the one comes, they don't come back. It's only that introduction,
Yeah.
so to say.
And as you said, one make that it's what I call the Baroque thinking that every composer has to have. It's not. It doesn't do. It's close up here. It doesn't do. It does. But in terms of rhythm, it stays on the dissonance. Those small thing where it becomes thematic because you have a small melody, small motif, and you stay. That's why I say it's Baroque, like Monteverdi, staying on the suspension, and staying in the low register of the instrument with contrabass, so the low strings make another word. When I say it's an example that I give all the time, this sort of I say a normal composer who has. It's not very interesting. So the great composer, what they do, they work on this sort of motif until it works. So at the end they do. So you see, you stay on the dissonance. Stay there, Berlioz. You can multiply. All the big melodies are small intervals, but you stay on what's one moves now. And hit. Oh, it's fantastic.
That's a very principle of the weight notes. For example, the whole prelude of Tristan, there's no such thing that Tristan chord doesn't exist.
Yeah.
It's just that it stays so long on passing that it becomes structural. So this is what he does with the C sharp. So it stays much longer because it's a passing note, if you want, but it stays much longer in it, so we sort of accept it as a structural note. The whole period of Tristan is a masterwork of just staying very long on passing note.
And
So that's
you are completely right. When I analyze that, I analyze all the, so of course the orchestration, the passing notes, the conformal memory with that. In terms of Baroque thing, if you take even at the end when the it's of course very erotic, so like that, and at the end you have the curtain which opens. So it's the anti-music. Here he releases. Even there, he does that. Just contrabass, cello. Look at this rhythm. It doesn't do. It does. Stay here on the edge and stay on the A flat. Oh, and the curtain opens. Even for that small element, he has this sort of Baroque thing where he puts the notes, which, and of course, the entire, if you look at the form where he repeats, I completely agree with you. I think it's 33, we have to stop. Huh? So thank you, and we'll continue this afternoon.
All right, are we ready to begin? Welcome, everybody, to the second half of our symposium this afternoon. I am William Caplin from the theory area of the Department of Music Research in the Schulich School of Music. And I want to present some aspects of musical form in the opening movement of Schubert's 8th and Unfinished Symphony. I'll start with a quick survey of the complete movement, followed then by a more detailed look at the exposition. And if there is time, I'll turn to some additional features in the later portions of the movement. Now, I'm not specifically directing issues to orchestration here, but what I'm hoping to do is to provide some terminology, some points of view on the formal organization of the work, which we can maybe see whether there are some interesting orchestrational connections, but I haven't actually thought them through very much in this presentation. I have an annotated score that I want to thank Félix Baril for helping me with this. I also want to thank Denis Bouliane and Stephen for helping me get this entire project set up. So they were very helpful at all stages. And I hope you can read the score. You're sitting all pretty far back. Feel free to come on up where you will probably enjoy reading the score better. Really, I won't bite up here. If you want to move up, I really recommend that you sit. Come on up. No, they won't. Nobody's coming. Bob, thank you. Break the ice. You'll be able to. Radislav, you can come on up. Tell Radislav. You're going to find it a lot easier to read my annotations. There you go. So I'll start with a quick survey of the complete movement, followed then by a more detailed look at the exposition. And if there's time, and I think there will be, I'll turn to some additional features in the later portions of the movement. So let's start with the overall form. The movement is in sonata form, which consists of 4 main sections: an exposition, which is repeated, a development, a recapitulation, and a coda. Now, some listeners may believe that the opening 8-bar theme is a slow introduction. You see that right at the bottom, played by the basses. We already started to have this discussion this morning. But there are, they think there could be a slow introduction. They would point to the fact that this theme projects a slow tempo and that it is eliminated from the recapitulation, which is true, and thus perhaps not a genuine part of the exposition. But a number of other arguments, a number of other aspects argues against this view. First, the theme really is in the same tempo as the rest of the movement. It's not in a distinct tempo, which is what we usually find with a slow introduction. And second, more importantly, it is repeated along with the exposition. That's something that we also would not have if this were a slow introduction. So for the purposes today, I'm going to consider the exposition to contain 2 main themes. The first one, just discussed, the opening 8 bars, and the second one, a highly expansive theme stretching from measure 9 to measure 38, where it concludes with a perfect authentic cadence, PAC, and the home key. So I think we're going to scroll down there to see at bar 38. So it's a very long second main theme. There we are, it's coming into view. With a perfect authentic cadence in the home key of B minor. Now, the transition that follows is extremely short. Just these 5 bars, measures 38 to 41. And now the rest of the exposition is made up of an 8-bar subordinate theme, and you can see the subordinate theme. This is the one with the famous tune. We were talking about it earlier today. And it closes down there, and it then is repeated. But when this subordinate theme is repeated, it is highly extended. So you could think of it as a second subordinate theme if you'd like, but it's also interesting to think of it as a magnificent variation on the first subordinate theme, or the original subordinate theme. One unusual feature is the key of the subordinate theme. Usually this would be in the relative major of the home key, so it would normally be in D major. But here, Schubert uses the submediant G major. It's not typical, but there are precedents for this usage in middle to late Beethoven. Now let's move on to the development. Here we can identify a classical pre-core core technique. These are concepts introduced by Arnold Schoenberg and his student Erwin Ratz. And some of you may know what I'm talking about using these terms. And those who don't have to worry. I'm not going to really be talking much about the development section, so I'll identify these parts to you when we do talk about them.
The pre-core is a kind of introduction to the development, and it's rather lengthy. It starts in bar 111, right after the double bar. You see the pre-core. And it stretches all the way to bar 146. And at the end of the pre-core, we then get core number 1. And this feature, this is at bar 147. Are we at 147?
Yes.
Yeah, good. At bar 147, and this features an 8-measure model, which is sequenced twice. Rather unusually, the core concludes at measure 71. We're going to scroll ahead to that. With, I keep losing my place, with a complete restatement of the main theme, the first main theme, but now in E minor. And this sets up the opening of core number 2, which is at bar 177. A core of a development is a unit that has a large size model, which is sequenced several times, and then other things happen. But we've already saw in the first core a large model, sequenced again, and now we have a new core where we have a 4-bar model, which is sequenced one time, only then to be followed by another 4-bar model. There it is, coming right up. New model at bar 185. Yeah. This model is sequenced 2 times, 2 sequential repetitions. Now, with respect to the melodic motivic material of the development section, you may have already noticed that it's almost all based upon main theme number 1, what many people call the slow introduction. That provides most of the melodic material. There are some places where there are accompanimental features that are drawn from the accompaniment to main theme number 2. You know, the 16th note accompaniment. We find that in some places. But for all practical purposes, it's the main theme number 1 that is saturates the music of the development section. Now, I mentioned this already. When we get to the recapitulation, and this starts at measure 219. Are we there?
Yes.
You'll notice that Schubert omits main theme number 1 from the recapitulation. Why? Super obvious. He had just used it up for all practical purposes in the development section, and he pushes then directly on to the second main theme. Now, main theme number 2 here in the recapitulation is more extensive than it was in the exposition. First, there is a move to E minor, a shift to the flat side of the tonal spectrum. Is the E minor showing up there? Geez, I should put my glasses on. Can't read anything else now. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, the shift to E minor. But then, Schubert redirects the music to F sharp minor. And this is a sudden swerve to the sharp side. So if you think of B minor as kind of central location, you have the flat side and you have the sharp side. So he goes from E minor and he flips all the way over to F sharp minor for the sharp side. Now, this is very unusual. It's not common at all in classical development sections to have a prominent move in this direction. But there's a reason why he does that, and that's because he's decided to choose D major as the subordinate key for the recapitulation. This is extremely unusual. Ordinarily, that would have been the key found in the exposition. So now he switches this around, puts D major in the recapitulation, and now in order to get to D major the same way he got to G major, he has to shift the whole end of the second subordinate, the second main theme, has to all be shifted to F sharp minor, so the music can then just run its course and end up in D major to the beginning of the subordinate theme. So that's what happens in the second main theme of the recapitulation. Now, unlike the exposition, which brought a simple 8-bar subordinate theme, which was then repeated and extended, the recapitulation at measure 257 only brings the extended version of the subordinate theme. So he drops out the first 8 bars. I think he feels we've heard this enough. Don't forget the exposition was repeated, so we've heard everything twice that was in the exposition. He doesn't need to play da da dee da 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 again in its original form. Now the theme begins in D, as I told you about. But as you probably all remember from your studies of sonata form, eventually this material has to get transposed back into the home key. And he does that first by bringing us back to B minor, the way it's extended, and that happens down, at bar 282, 281. Shifts to B minor, and then at bar 299, he changes modality and we get B major, which is the appropriate modality for this part in the subordinate theme. So in the course of this extended subordinate theme, he's managed to go from D major to B minor and then to B major for the music that should sound major mode in the recapitulation. So that all works out well. Now let's look at the very beginning of the coda. This happens right after the recapitulation. And what we notice here, of course, is that the coda, the main theme, the first main theme is now brought back. And it's brought back in B minor. In other words, the coda has recapitulated the first main theme because one of the main jobs of a coda is to do things, making up for things that couldn't be done in an earlier part of the piece. So there was a good reason why he had to leave out the first main theme at the beginning of the recap, we explained that. But now he uses the coda to compensate for that fact, brings it back. And in fact, the coda, which is relatively short, is just like the development section, is saturated entirely with this first main theme material. And the piece ends with a number of codettas that that use the head motive of the main theme. Da, da, dee, dum, bum, is repeated a whole bunch of times. Finally, there's a very brief cadence at the end. And then that wonderful low chord that Fabien drew our attention to at the very end of the movement. Fantastic sonority. Okay, that's a general overview of the piece. Are there any questions, just so we're all on the same page? No? We're good? I should just, a couple of words of conclusion about the overall form. The movement generally follows the norms of classical symphonic sonata form writing. But we do find a number of major exceptions. The first is the transition, which is exceedingly short. It doesn't have its own melodic materials, and it does not even constitute a complete thematic unit of the kind we would normally encounter in the transition of a symphonic work. Second, the main theme of the exposition is not brought back at the start of the recap. We talked about that. And third, the subordinate theme of the recapitulation begins in the relative major. That's very, very unusual. So, other than those principal major markers that are not typical of a classical style form, the overall arch of this sonata movement is relatively classical. But when we start digging down into the details, we start to see that things are very different. And we start to encounter all sorts of things that are simply not classical. And this is something that I want to emphasize in the course of my talk. Now, when I talk about Schubert departing significantly from classical norms, I'm not doing so to put him down. Please make clear that that's not the objective whatsoever. It's rather to show how genuinely progressive, I would say almost radical, Schubert actually was. He anticipated procedures that were then developed both in the early Romantic area and also into the mid to late 19th century. Schubert is really the precursor for much of 19th century music compositional thinking. And we find some of those elements already here in the Unfinished Symphony. So I want to, as we look at the details of the exposition, I will point out places where this is not typically classical. This is more romantic. in conception. So Schubert is often linked with the Viennese high classical composers, Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. And here I would say Beethoven is fully classical, not romantic. As many of the history books talk about Beethoven becoming romantic, I don't buy that personally. And I hear Schubert as entirely romantic and not classical. So maybe it's a strong binary that I propose, but that's my view looking at this music. Okay, so now on to the main topic, which is the exposition section. And for this, I've distributed another handout from you. And unfortunately, there's going to be a little logistical issues here. We're going to move from the handout to the screen. We're going to move back and forth. So I apologize. It was just a question of not having enough time to integrate this entire set of tools to make it more transparent. But I think we'll make it work. To begin, to show you a little bit of what I mean about the difference between classical and romantic, I want to highlight one issue that we find pretty prevalent in this sonata, in the sonata form. So my very first example is an example by Mozart, the famous subordinate theme from the G minor symphony. Da dee dum dee dum bum ba da dee da dum dee da dee da dee da dee dum bum. That's the subordinate theme. You'll notice that after the opening phrase, which is an antecedent, it ends with a half cadence, the next two bars bring a sequential progression of harmonies. In fact, the sequences, they're all in root position, which is actually not so typical classical, very typical romantic, actually. But in any case, we have the sequence, and then the next two bars bring the cadence, 2, 6, 5, 7, 1. Now, what you observe here is that Mozart completely distinguishes the sequential material from the cadential material. And this is something that the classical composers routinely do, and they're very careful about it. In fact, it's quite rare that they mix this up. But in the early Romantic period, and we're going to see this a lot in this piece today, Schubert is often projecting something as sequential, and then it turns into being cadential in a way that, how did that happen? Kind of by insistence, rather than by a clear, oh, now I'm doing sequential, but now I'm doing cadential. So this blurring, the ambiguity of that which is sequential and that which is cadential is significant. Now, why am I talking about only harmony here? Well, this has a lot to do with form, because sequences are associated with middle things, being in the middle, what I call medial functionality. When we hear sequences, we feel that we're in the middle of things because things are in flux. When we get to a cadence, of course, we're talking about being at the ends of things. So if sequences start getting confused with cadences, then there's a confusion of formal functionality. Are we doing a middle thing? Are we doing an end thing? And this is something that we find highlighted quite a bit. And I'll point out some examples of it as we go along. So let's begin our examination with the first main theme. So please turn back to your full score now. And we're going to look at the bottom. There's a lot to say about this theme, but I just don't have time to do it. I really want to draw your attention to one detail alone. And that is, how does this theme cadence? Well, there's two options here. That low F sharp, which is the dominant, could be heard as the ultimate chord of a half cadence progression, or it could be heard as a penultimate chord of an authentic cadential progression, which would resolve to the B, the downbeat of bar 9. So we have a question here. Is this a half cadence, or is it a PAC? So I think what would be interesting is to listen to what von Karajan does in his performance. And I'll ask you to consider which of these cadential articulations you think he may have been projecting here. I have to do some technology things. Oh no, I lost your password, babies. Nothing ever works. You know that. Thank you. Okay. So let me play the first main theme. Oh, very neat. What has happened here?
Is the volume up? It's just that the volume is so low for this first example, and then it's high in the other examples. Okay, I'll turn it up.
Yeah. I thought I had it higher.
No, it's maximum. Okay. I'll just turn it back down.
Can we try that once again?
Yeah.
Yeah, you really need to hear it because there's a real phrasing issue that goes on here. Let's try it again. Yeah, well, that's plenty loud now. Half cadence. PAC. Okay. So, what do you think? Let's do analysis by democracy. So, raise your hands if you heard a half cadence. Higher. Oh, that's interesting. About 2/3, 40% maybe. So raise your hands if you heard a PAC. Actually, it's kind of split, isn't it? It's kind of split. Now, personally, and this is just my own personal reaction, I heard a half cadence here. I heard Foncarian decrescendoing a little bit towards the very end, such that when the tonic came, it sounded to me like it was a beginning impulse alone, rather than an ending impulse. But there's no right or wrong answer here. People are going to have this question. And in fact, in my work on Schubert that I've done, I've noticed that Schubert is all of the time confusing us with whether he thinks he's writing half cadences or if he's writing authentic cadences. It's something just absolutely part and parcel of his style. It comes up over and over again in his pieces. And this is, I think, a really nice example. Okay. So now let's consider the second main theme, which I identify as containing 3 formal units. Unit 1 begins with a thematic introduction in measures 9 through 12. Now, I should note that it is odd for a second main theme to include an introductory passage. And indeed, this helps support the idea that main theme 1 might really just be a slow introduction. It's not my view, but you could bring that to bear for that perspective. And then it was beautiful this morning when we talked about the question is, if you can just back up slightly, Felix, and I wrote thematic introduction question mark. Why? Because are we sure that that's what we think it is when we first hear it? I wasn't so absolutely certain. And then we brought in the idea that the first violin's playing it particularly, and then of course that little motive, A sharp, B, C sharp, which is shared by the dee, dum, da, da, dum, dee, right? So there is, again, ambiguity about that in this passage as well. But let's say that it's a thematic introduction because following this, one other thing. If you look at the bass line, it's easy to think that he's just doing a whole series of Bs here. Do you see that? Except that he occasionally pops down to a G to support a diminished 7th chord in a strange position. So I hear this G as a marked pitch because of its unusual placement. It doesn't seem clear quite what it's doing there. So in the course of the analysis, keep your eyes open for arrows. So I put arrows by all sorts of places where I think there's something interesting to say about the note G. Okay? So now the main theme proper, second main theme. This begins at measure 13 with a 2-bar basic idea. This is all nice and classical. The 2-bar basic idea is repeated to give us a presentation phrase, which is followed by a 4-bar continuation phrase. And if we get to a cadence. Okay, this all seems nice and normal, except there's something really weird that just happened. Can anybody pick it out? What just happened there? Look at you, my analysis is there. So we have a presentation, continuation, and let's go back and look at the cadence.
4 is extended.
What's the story? What?
It's 4 plus 5.
Yes, okay. But what kind of, where's the cadence?
It's perfect cadence.
It's a perfect authentic cadence, that's fine. That would we expect for a main theme.
But in D,
Yeah. It's in D, it's in the wrong key. It's in the wrong key. He's already gotten to the key that we should be hearing in the subordinate theme. Of course, we know that that's not the key we're going to get. So something's wrong with that. And we were talking about this wonderful accent that happens. We talked quite a bit about the accent that the horn gave to it. So what sounds a little bit like to me, and if I were conducting this piece, I might have the performers do it a little bit more, a little differently than what Karajan does. It give maybe a bit more of a zing to it. But I would say like, oh no, I really meant to write a half cadence. You see? So he does the D, and then he kind of says, no, should have been a half cadence all along. So he throws in the dominant, you know, to get that. And as well, we get a nice G. That was that horn pitch we've been talking about. It's a nice G. It's for the horn, it's an F, but it's this G resolving, oscillating with the F sharp, right? So, yeah, so it kind of Schubert realizes that it wasn't done quite right. So now the theme is going to start over again. And so what do we think is going to happen this time? Well, this was kind of a weird antecedent, maybe. So maybe we think we're going to get a consequent phrase. So let's see what develops there. So we get the presentation. Let's continue on. The presentation continues on. We get now something new that we didn't get the first time. What's the matter?
Maybe the 5-minute warning.
Are we done with the entire presentation?
Yes.
No.
Half an hour.
That was a half hour?
5 minutes.
Oh, that's terrible. Okay. Boy, I really timed this badly. I terribly apologize. I have so many more interesting things to talk about. Anyway, in the repeat of this, we get a sequential passage, and he brings us to the dominant as a sequence. And that's the point I was trying to say before. So he gives us kind of a half cadence here, except that half cadence comes out of a sequence. At the very end of the main theme, he finally brings the perfect authentic cadence we were talking about. Can we go quickly to the subordinate theme? Let's go quickly there. And so the famous theme is showing down there. I put in the words, if you want to check those out. And now you can look on. You can now look on the additional examples. Did you read the words of this? This is the symphony that Schubert wrote but never finished. No? You don't know these words? Now, this seems like a pretty ordinary tune that everybody knows. We've sung this since we were kids, right? We know this tune so well, but it is utterly non-classical. And the main thing, the reason why it's non-classical, we get an opening motive, da-dum, motive A, then we get a B, da-da-da-dum. And now what does he do? He reverses it, da-da-da-da, da-da-da, da-dum. So he makes this kind of palindrome motive, which is extremely unusual. I don't know a single classical theme that does anything like this kind of palindromic effect. Yeah. Then, in the second phrase, we get a nice sequence. He shifts the whole thing up, but then, of course, he's got to bring it back down, and when he brings it back down, he does it in such a way that it sounds like it's a sequence down, but that also brings the cadence. And if you look at the harmonic analysis, if you actually look on the additional examples page, this is example 2, the harmonic analysis. You see that you can analyze the harmonies of this cadence as either sequential, a circle of fifths, or as cadential. And it's this kind of confusion that we find rampant in Schubert's music. Now the theme is expanded, and we go just a little bit further. Yeah, we get to this wonderful moment where he has one of his dramatic outbursts. What happens the second time we hear the theme is we get an evaded cadence. Then we get this outburst. Now, harmonically, it's actually a series of cadential harmonies. And he builds up, and we talked about the orchestrational effect and how he builds this big crescendo here. But something else happens. If you just go to the next page, you see the syncopations? right at that point, he changes the harmony in a way that abandons the cadence. So it sounds like he's going to do the cadence and then he abandons it, as though the syncopations were just kind of, no, we didn't quite get it right. And then he launches into a new continuation with all of that model sequence stuff that we talked about also earlier on this morning. Let's press ahead from there. And we then get at MAR 81, again, a sequence sounds, but it ends up becoming cadential. This blurring of what is sequential and what is cadential is continuing to play itself out. Finally, we get the final PAC of the subordinate theme down right at the bottom of there. But if you look at the harmonies, 1, 5 of 2, 2, 5, 1, that was the same harmonic progression that he did for the opening subordinate theme the first time, so that things are not entirely clear sequence and cadence. It's only in the closing section that follows, and maybe I'll play that, if I may. I'm going to skip ahead. Closing section, yeah, I'm going to play this. And now I want you to hear that he starts out his da-dum, be-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-da, and you'll notice he then writes a distinctly different cadential idea. He separates the cadence out from the sequence. And he understood kind of what the problem was. Okay, so that was a real fast run through. I have some interesting things to talk about that happen later on in the movement, particularly with that note G. And maybe just, if I could do one more thing, if you go to the very end of the movement, let's look at the main theme when it comes back in the coda. And this, I promise, is the end. What happened there? What happened there? A completely unambiguous PAC. He added in the winds. In fact, it's only just the solo flute, the upper flute is the only one that really makes that clear. It's a great orchestrational touch. So actually, Schubert did mean that by the end of the piece, if we weren't sure if this was going to end with a half cadence or a PAC, he shows us his intention, at least for the very end of the piece, which I think is interesting. Maybe these can come up in our later discussions. Thank you.
Good. Okay. Welcome, everybody. I'm not going to talk about the Schubert knock. We're going to do that in the session, the workshop session. I'm going to give a very brief overview of some of the approach that we've taken by trying to link various kinds of auditory grouping principles to things that go on in orchestration. So basically the idea of grouping principles as structuring of things, and oftentimes using timbre and various other musical parameters. So a lot of orchestration aims are implicitly related to auditory grouping principles, and they organize the acoustic environment and determine things like what sounds are grouped together into musical events in concurrent grouping, whether these events are chunked, whether these things are grouped together over time into sequential grouping, and whether these event groups are then chunked into things that are useful as units that we might have, such as motives, themes, phrases, and so on and so forth. One of the things that's interesting here is the question about whether what the relationship between these things and various kinds of orchestration devices might be. So we know that perceptual qualities are computed on the results of grouping processes. Okay, so we're looking at what are the things that result perceptually from these different kinds of grouping, and then how does that relate to various kinds of orchestral effects that we might have. So for example, timbre, pitch, dynamics, spatial position, and things like that
emerge from acoustic components that get grouped together into events. So events have these properties, and the properties we perceive depend on what gets grouped together. Various things like melodic contours, rhythmic patterns, and timbral patterns are properties of streams of events, notes that get connected together, and then we extract the relations among those events, and that's how we perceive these different kinds of patterns that are going on. And that is related to segregation or integration of streams, formation of various kinds of surface textures, and also orchestral strata, sort of background, middle ground, and foreground strata. Finally, the chunking of events into streams creates things like motives, phrases, themes, and sections, and so on. And these are done by various kinds of orchestral contrasts that we could be having for changes of instrumentation, changes of register, changes of texture of various kinds could be going on at these kinds of things. So we've come up with a number of analysis categories that we're actually implementing into the OrcView sort of orchestration analysis platform, which Felix Boril is leading. And so we have in concurrent grouping whether things blend or don't blend together, okay? And inside of blend we have whether two categories which we call timbral augmentation and timbral emergence. Augmentation is where other instruments embellish or highlight a dominating instrument, and emergence is where they all fuse together and something new emerges. Fabien was talking a little bit about those kinds of notions this morning. Non-blend, particularly in the cases where we have all the features that normally make concurrent grouping happen, but they're still not fusing together, we call timbral heterogeneity, and I'll show examples of that in a moment. Under sequential grouping, we're interested in the difference between things that integrate over time and things that separate over time. So here we have the integration of various notes into an auditory stream, which would be considered sort of a musical mind of some kind, or a virtual voice, whether those things get integrated into surface textures. And then the separation into multiple streams, so in the case of polyphony, you have multiple streams that you can hear independently, or you might have another case where we have stratification. Here you have layers that are heard independently, a foreground layer and a background layer, for example, and sometimes you can have foreground, middle ground, and background layers going on in orchestration. In terms of segmental grouping, we're primarily interested here in terms of contrasts that are happening through instrumentation. So various kinds of antiphonal contrasts, having one instrument that's echoed by another instrument on the same pattern, having a timbral melodic and rhythmic pattern that's passed from instrument to instrument in things like timbral shifts, and then various other kinds of timbral contrasts that are in addition to the ones that I just mentioned there. And then, of course, larger scale kinds of things, changes that take place, register, texture, and instrumentation that actually cause you to perceive various kinds of sectional boundaries and things like that. So this is the main kinds of categories that we've been using to analyze what's going on in pieces. So let me go through a few of these, first starting with concurrent grouping, which is either blend or not blend. Now in concurrent grouping, there's a number of features, as we know from auditory scene analysis, that determine whether things fuse together into events or not. Do the acoustic components start and stop at the same time? Do they have harmonic relations? And are they keeping those relations in parallel over time in terms of pitch and of dynamics, for example, or amplitude and frequency, as we would say in acoustic terms? Sometimes those are not enough, and we also need to take into account certain timbral characteristics of the different instruments that are playing at the same time. So here we're interested if we have these properties. So for example, if I have doubling at the octave, or the octave and the fifth, or something like that, those are harmonicity. If they're starting and stopping at the same time, we have synchrony. And if they keep those relationships over time, then we have the parallelism. And those are features that will help things sort of blend together. Sometimes that's not enough, and it depends on the actual timbral characteristics, the acoustic characteristics of the sources themselves. So you might have cases where you don't have enough of an overlap of the frequency spectra of the sounds. You have some very low ones and some very high ones, and they won't actually fuse together, even though all these other parameters are actually taking place. Another thing related to spectral relations, and this happens less often in classical and romantic music and more in contemporary music, where you have higher degrees of spectral density and you can't separate things out because they're all too close together. If you think of Atmosphera by Ligeti, or Threnody for the Victims of Hiroshima, or Penderecki, there you have a spectral density that is so dense that you can't actually analyze out all the different components that are there. One of the important things here is that timbre itself depends on how things get grouped together. So if we have things that fuse, they give rise to a new timbre. So timbre arises from concurrent grouping. And then it will affect things like sequential grouping and segmental grouping later on. And of course, I'm talking about timbre here because we're talking about what do we do with instruments. How can we create new timbres through the combination of instruments, and how can we use then the timbres that result from that to create musical structure sequentially and then segmentally as well. So here's the grouping structure we have. Basically we have either things either blend or they don't blend. When they do blend, we can have either timbral augmentation, so a dominating instrument that's embellished by other instruments, timbral emergence where they all fuse together and create a completely new timbre, and it's difficult to actually analyze out the instruments that are composing it, and then timbral heterogeny where we don't have actually the blend that's going on in this particular case. In all these cases, we can either have sustained versions of this, where it's sustained over time, or they're punctuated, so they happen very quickly and you don't have time to analyze them. So duration also plays a role in how easy it is to analyze out what is going on in things. And in the case of sustained ones, they can either be stable in terms of their instrumentation, or the instrumentation can actually be changing over time, where we get things like timbral modulations and so on. Okay? So that's the main grouping structure. I'm going very fast on this, but we'll go into details when we analyze the Schubert. I'm going to show 3 examples, as you can see here: a stable sustained timbral emergence, a punctuated timbral emergence, and a stable sustained timbral heterogeny. So here's the case, which actually Fabien mentioned this morning, from Debussy, okay, where we have basically the English horn and the trumpet with a mute, which are sort of blending together. And this kind of timbral emergence sounds neither like an English horn nor a trumpet to me, anyway. And so let's have a listen to that. This is done in Orc play. Famous foghorn timbre, as Fabien was mentioning this morning. Here's an example of a timbral emergence, which is primarily a punctuation blend. Okay, it's kind of hard to analyze what's going on in there because it happens too fast, basically. And if you just threw that at your orchestration class and said, give me the orchestration of that, I'm sure they would have a difficult time in that particular case, except for the timpani, maybe. And here we have a case of timbral heterogeny, okay, heterogeneity, where we basically have some different instruments that are playing, sort of trumpets and harp and things like that. But we have tubular bells in there, okay, which have a completely different spectrum that doesn't overlap with the others. And it's the tubular bells that tend to stand out in this particular case here. So they're all moving in parallel. We have these harmonic relations and so on, but there's something about both the attack quality, the inharmonicity, and the high spectral frequencies that are present in the timbral, in the tubular bells, that make them not fuse together with the other instruments. Moving on to sequential grouping, and here we're interested in either integration or segregation of things over time, forming of musical lines, if you will, of virtual voices and so on. Here the basic principle related to continuity in various kinds. So we can have spectral continuity in pitch or timbre, loudness continuity, spatial continuity, basically because different sound sources, what we're doing here is the brain's trying to figure out what are the events that are happening that are coming from the same sound source. It's trying to track the sound source over time. And basically, normal sound sources don't change rapidly in pitch, in timbre, in loudness, and where they are in space. And so the brain is looking for continuity here, and when these things are continuous, it will connect them over time, and when they're discontinuous, it will try to separate them into separate streams. So here, basically, in terms of orchestration, we know that timbral differentiation can cause stream segregation or stratification, whereas timbral similarity will promote stream integration and the coherence of the different events into strata or to streams. Okay? And we know that this can be predicted from things like timbre space. Timbral similarity can be measured in terms of timbre spaces and so on. I don't have any time to go into those details, but basically just the idea here is that timbral similarity and timbral difference are playing a role in whether things are being grouped together over time and connected to one another sequentially. So here's the basic structure of this grouping hierarchy. So we either have integration of streams or of surface textures, and I'll define surface textures in a moment. And we can have segregation into multiple streams or into orchestral layers. And again, each of these can either be stable in terms of instrumentation or transforming in their instrumentation over time. So I'll give you an example of a stable stream integration and of a transforming stratification here. Here's the case of a stable stream integration. All the instruments that you see shown in the gold boxes here are basically playing sort of primarily octave doublings that are going on here. And all of these are being fused together into a single kind of stream. Even though there's multiple instruments, they're creating a kind of a virtual voice, which is the combination of all these instruments together against the punctuated background. Now, one thing that helps the integration there is all these punctuated things in the background actually sort of mask the attacks, so any sort of slight asynchronies and things like that could actually be overridden by that to help things sort of fuse together. In the case of sort of a transforming stratification, again from Borodin, here we have an example where we have, for example, step over here, we have the woodwinds and I think the horns there. Can't really read it here. Are basically in the foreground. We have these changes between the different instruments that are happening, and then in the background we have some sustained strings, and the middle ground we have sustained strings, and then we also have these punctuations going down in the lower strings here. But where this is transforming is at one point when we have this then comes to the foreground because everything else is not moving, and then it recedes back into the middle ground again afterwards. So that's why it's a transforming stratification. The idea here is that some instruments are in one layer and they can move to another layer depending on what's happening. We call that the transforming stratification. Move to the foreground. Okay. Here's an interesting case where highest is not always necessarily foreground. So in the case here, we have those violins, but because they're so steady, they sort of move into the background. It's the things that are moving in the sort of middle registers that our attention is actually drawn to. So this notion of foreground, background, so it has to do with auditory salience of some kind, things that move, things that are more prominent, things that are more salient, or what our attention is drawn to, and that sort of makes things foreground or background depending on how much we can actually focus on these things. Moving on to segmental grouping of various kinds of timbral contrasts, as I mentioned before here. Here, basically, the idea is that timbral change can cause segmentation of sequences, as can other kinds of change, like pitch change, duration change, articulation change, dynamics change, and so on. And so similarities in all these things can also give rise to larger scale sections and so on, as Irene de Liège in Belgium and so on. Therefore, the point here is that timbre change can create boundaries, so we can use instrumentation to create boundaries, and timbral similarity can help cohere over periods of time. So we have things that stay the same in timbre or in register or in pitch or texture and things like that. And then when we have changes, we create a boundary, and then there's similarities on the other side that are different from these similarities here that actually create a new section in that particular case. Some examples of segmental grouping here. We have the antiphonal contrast, as I mentioned, and timbral echoes. I'm going to show examples of timbral shifts, general contrast, and sectional contrast. Here's an example of a timbral shift, or what we called originally the timbral hot potato, where you basically have a pattern, a musical pattern that is passed from one instrument to the next. In this particular case, it's going from clarinet to flute to oboe to clarinet, with the fragmentation on the last parts, the oboe and the clarinet. And then this pattern is repeated several times. So Beethoven here for the Egmont, which is actually creating a timbral arc, which becomes a pattern in and of itself that actually then sort of is repeating itself over time. I have to click on this one. And so on, it goes on. In the case, so these we have some kind of fragmentation, contrasts that are happening, but we're actually connecting them together in this particular case, so they create a kind of a timbral pattern. Here's a case of some general timbre contrasts, and here we're using changes between different instrumental groups to actually underline the structure that's going on both harmonically, thematically, and texturally. And this is from Sibelius' Second Symphony. So here's the changes that matter. So we have one group that stays more or less the same, and then the interceding groups are actually changing in instrumentation each time. So if you were to reduce that all just to piano, I'm sure you wouldn't at all get the same kind of structure that you're getting here that's being given by the instrumentation in this particular case here. As an example of sectional grouping, where you have large-scale changes in instrumentation and so on, this is the kind of orchestration graphs created by Emily Dolan in her book, The Orchestral Revolution, The Technologies of Timbre in the Time of Haydn. And she's done a lot of analyses of Haydn, particularly in his second movements throughout a number of symphonies. The instrumentation is shown by the colors, so you have strings in greens and then woodwinds in blues and purple, brass in sort of oranges and golds, and then percussion on top. And I think it's very clear to see from this kind of graph where changes in instrumentation are actually creating very strong sectional structure of these kinds of things. And I'm just going to play an example for you that is actually where that black, if I can find my mouse here, I'll show you where it is. This black bracket right here is. So here you see some local changes, but also larger scale changes going on. I think what's interesting is to take these kinds of things where we're just talking about these sort of grouping things and then start trying to link them to the formal and the functional kinds of things that are going on in these pieces. These are just basically the perceptual surface. How is it organizing things into groups, both at a given time, across time, and then segmenting things as we go. So the global structure of our hierarchy of different grouping effects here is related to right here. So we have basically things that are related to event formation, to event sequencing of various kinds, and then the unit formation of musical units of various kinds. And I think what's mostly challenging in trying to understand how this is actually working in music itself is the fact that all these feed back into one another and influence each other in a very interactive way, which makes things a lot more complicated to analyze. But as I keep telling my theorist colleagues, this kind of complexity is actually the perceptual reality of real music, and so we have to deal with it anyway, even if we can't necessarily always categorize things perfectly in that way. So I want to thank my two main collaborators here, Kit Soda, who's here, and Megan Goodchild, who's now at Queen's University, and all the fine years of the Music Perception and Cognition Laboratory. And of course, we're financed by the ACTOR project in part, and by others, and the great collaboration that we have at the Orchestral Music Library. My hat off to you, gentlemen. It's been absolutely extraordinary for this kind of work. Thank you.
So, all of us have too much stuff to present, but since I know that maybe a third of the audience here, or maybe more, are not acquainted very much with the ACTOR work, I will take 5 minutes just to make a very, very, very quick and short survey of the work which we're doing. Stephen has presented the orchestration grouping effects, but we have other things going on also. We call that legs, we have techniques. So I'm just going to go very, very fast. So this is what we're going to go to 5 minutes very fast, and then we go to the techniques which I'm supposed to present more thoroughly today. So orchestration is a practice, it's a skill from one point of view. It's supposed some knowledge, you have to learn the technique, you look at different scores. It's not all too different from counterpoint, harmony, anything like that. But it can also be studied from
different perspectives. So there are different approaches possible. You can look at the orchestration from the perceptual point of view, the point of view of techniques, also the functions, what we believe a composer had in mind when he or she did certain things. So that's important to realize that. Before actually there was a project which was a Orchestration project. That means the work we do together now is about 10 years old. That's important to realize that really very fast. That was the first thing going on there. And this is the core idea, that we will have cross-fertilization of perspectives. So we gain something from learning about different things. Orchestration treatise, analysis, excerpts, core analysis, mining data, practice, and all that into a pool of connecting knowledge pool, so to say. That's quite important. So what Stephen presented, this is another way of saying exactly the same as what he did, but you will realize why I did that. If you look at concurrent grouping, going to sequential grouping and sequential grouping, very simply, we go from the vertical, smaller chunk of events and gradually to larger chunk of events. This is an oversimplification, but this shows a little bit how this functions. So something also which Stephen and I and many colleagues also discussed over the years is that there's a terminology which is typical of cognitive perception, which is very important, which is rooted in a lot of practice, not only music. But of course, there's also a terminology which is used, let's say, in the classroom. Orchestrators talks of different concepts, use different terms. And some of those terms at times are confusing, they're metaphorical, at times they're very technical, but we sort of manage to communicate. But there was a need in our team at some point to try to, is there such a thing like a catalog of techniques which are used on terms in which we can all understand together? This we've seen precisely. So what has been done? There's been analysis, also classification. What seems obvious, because Stephen presented so clearly, is the research of many, many years and decades, if I might say so. But the need of classifying grouping effects is important, but just as much as the need of trying to classify orchestral techniques. So it's a difficult thing. There were tests, sonic renderings. Then we developed what we call a taxonomy. The word taxonomy is not taxidermy, so we're not dealing with dead corpse, but we like music. So very much is try to organize the world in a meaningful way, so we can understand. Taxonomy comes from the species, mammals, all sorts of animals, plants, living beings. So integrate those results, transfer that knowledge. Now, the annotation is the key. What Stephen showed us is some annotations and scores. Fabien did also some annotations and scores. Many of us, all of us, at some point want to present a point. This is what I perceive things, this is what I perceive of that score. So we take our pencil, we make squares, rounds, highlights of different colors and shapes, and we actually communicate our ideas through that. So an image might be worth 1,000 words, yes, but if this image is not clear, it might blur things up. So we develop also the orchestra system. I'm going to go very fast with that. It's just that an orchestra, it's very difficult to isolate instruments in an orchestra. Had we had the possibility, if we had the possibility, we would have our own symphony orchestra at disposal every day, and we're going to record everything we want, the way we want, but this is going to remain a dream, certainly in this country, for a little while. So we developed a system, OrgSim, which is a simulator, and I'm going to go not very far with that, but over the last 10 years, which would be able to recreate the sound of a symphony orchestra as close as possible to reality. So we can isolate, when we do perceptual tests, we can isolate instruments and submit that to test and get something which is convincing. So I'm going to go very far with that. We went into great detail into simulating that. It's not the point here. And then we had to validate those results. So all the scores which some of you have listened to in OrgPlay were produced in OrgSim, but they were validated over years with testing, A/B comparison, to see. 5 years ago, our results were very poor. Everyone would say, well, this really sounds like synthetic. But nowadays, we have renditions which are barely distinguishable for original reference recording. So that's important to say that this went that way. I'm not going to play that today, but
if you want, you can compare, for example, we've been able to model recordings on reference recording. Dutoit has been used, Caplin has been used, Bouliane has been used. And at the point now that you go A, B, one to the other, we model not only the actual flux, the discourse, the tempo, the speed, the timbre, very precisely. So all that to say that those tools can be useful. The point is not to replace an orchestra. We always always have the parallel recording. But in class, you can isolate certain instruments and demonstrate certain things you want to demonstrate. So that's important to know what the background is now. So OrgPlay, I'm going to go fast here. OrgSym is a very complex system. It takes a big machine, it costs a lot of money, but OrgPlay now is available free for all of you for nothing, barely, and you can use it, and it's an important tool to learn. That's all we do. So I'm going to go very fast with that. But again, I'm going back to annotations. So annotations, we say an image word counting word, well, these are Confucius, but not really true. It's actually Mr. Barnard, which as the first manager of Street Railways in 1921 is actually credited with that quoting. So is it true? Does a picture really worth 1,000 words? That's what we need to explore. Those are first annotations which were done in the Orchestral database, which were done by hand. You can imagine the team worked 4 years to go to annotations. And it's a very valid database now. But we understand that it's done manually. It's not searchable. You don't have information you can search with a machine. And it's prone to mistake because we're human beings. All this information has been transcribed by hand. And I remember Kit, I don't know how many years ago, Kit Soden mentioned, could we have something a bit more user-friendly, automatized, which would annotate scores directly? So those are examples. Now, look, I'll show you some annotations very fast. They all have different colors, all have different codes. This is one we know here. You can take them all over the place. Everyone does that in zillion, thousands of forms. Quite an array of sign and symbol, but not really easily compatible with each other. I was talking with Pierre Michel, a good friend of mine in Strasbourg, who specialized on analysis of performance and rendition of a score, especially music of DT also. And he was displaying at one of those symposiums we go to, a beautiful color poster of Ligeti piece with all squares and colors and shades and stuff, beautifully representation. And I asked Pierre, what's the code? He said, oh, come on, I forgot, 10 years ago. It was beautiful, but it was very difficult to decipher what was meant by that. So, all I say with that here, we were in need to have taxonomic legs. The idea of a leg, that means that's a perspective. You analyze a orchestration from this perspective, from this other one, and all those legs eventually can become actually complementary. So that's the idea. So, now, my task, and not only mine because I work with many students and many colleagues here, was to try to formulate a catalog raisonné, a taxonomy of techniques. That means, of course, we went through all orchestral treaties available, tried to analyze how is this term used, what's the meaning of that, the term evolved over time, at times it's misused, all sorts of different things. Kit also did wonderful work 2-3 years ago, listing most of the terminology in many of those treaties here, which try to combine, simplify, and is there a common ground possible? So, yeah, it was a bit complicated, so we decided to try to figure a system. Okay, how do we function about that? The next leg, which happened necessarily, was the orchestration techniques. Okay, I want to show you that here and that. Remember that one? Okay, so it's a different thing, but it's based on the same structure. We go from the vertical, from the simple to the more complex horizontal. It's not one-to-one, doesn't match, but it has the same idea in mind. So we've developed 8-part catalog of techniques, and this goes from the simple to the more complex. Because all that had to do also with how you approach those techniques in the classroom. Where do you start? How do you approach all those things? So that was the idea. So again, there was analysis, there was classification, and again, we stumbled over the problem of annotations. If I'm going to annotate techniques with the same boxes as Stephen used for perceptual effects, we're going to get a lot of confusion. So we have to define a comparative system. looking for a structure which underlies all that. So, to simplify, we have the effect types presented that way, which Stephen showed us. We have also technique types. To make a long story short, if you're going to talk to students, or even secondary school or primary school students, you will talk of basic instrumentation, whether an instrument plays or not. Whether it's solo or it's tutti, a secondary school teacher could find examples of solo flute in their repertoire. So that would be very, very basic, what instrument is there. The second thing which I've learned over the years is that an orchestral score is a complex web of sound. So there's a layering involved. What is all that part of one layer, or is there some depth in the orchestration? Is there something foreground, middle ground, background? This is something which needs to be addressed. Now, once you identify some layers, how the composer created those layers, the techniques for that, you might want to compare how they are. What's the texture of each layer, and how do those layers relate together? Are we related? After that, we have into vertical structuring, which is very similar to juxtapose and interlock. This is a standard thing which study in orchestration. After, into a slightly more complex state, doubling. Doubling is not an easy thing to define. It's a very complex thing, but you can identify that. We also have coupling, and there's some debate about the terminology of that, but we decided to define, for pedagogical reasons, doubling as the same pitch class, and coupling the different pitch classes. Of course, couplings come from the terminology of classical writing also, which is actually coupling intervals. So after that, we go into interplay and progression. So that means how instruments interplay together, how do they progress in time. You see that we're coming closer to a chunk of music. After that, resonance, timbral manipulation, everything which is a sustained sound. In the piano, you have the sustained pedal, and you can hold what you want. In the orchestra, you write out your resonance, you write out your timbral prolongation, all those things. So this becomes more sophisticated. So exosemantics is anything which is outside of music, refers outside of music. You might be surprised to see that in the classical techniques, but in a lot of treatises of orchestration, people talk very strongly about exosemantic. It sounds like this and like that. For example, your imitation of a gagaku would be an exosemantic, an acoustic anaphone. This is what it is. So treatises talk of that, so we have to try to integrate that. So you see, now what are the connections? The idea is that if we can analyze the grouping effects, if we can analyze the techniques, we could eventually say this technique has been used as a response to a function, eventually. But what does it materialize into, and how do we perceive it? So we have to find the links between all those things. So you see, the more detailed thing, you will have layering, generic layer, foreground, the type of texture relationships, vertical structuring, we have doubling, we have coupling, and we have all those things here, variation, contrast, information, taking in, filling out, climax, all sort of things which we can study. And actually, we found hundreds of examples. We've tested that over the years to see if they correspond to some reality. So that's important. Now, going back to OrvView. OrvView is simply a software which would enable you to annotate directly in the score. And what you are going to annotate in the score will directly transfer. If you circle out flute and trumpet, it will be written flute and trumpet has been circled out representing this and this effect. So that saves enormous amount of time. But in order to do that, we have to really find an underlying structure. So that's what it is. So we have actually the possibility to have different legs. That could be functions, could be techniques, could be modes of playing, grouping effects, historical things, oral phonology, formal analysis. There's no end to that. We'll never be able to finish all that. But if we have a couple of legs which we're happy from, we can learn from all those legs and the complementarity of those legs. So that's the idea. One important key aspect is that we have basic segmentation. We also have ways of parameter. For example, if you have 10 different techniques and 100 different shades, you cannot annotate with color. Your score will be full of color, will be undesirable. There's no way you can understand that. But you have a set of parameters which you could say are mutually exclusive, a roll down menu, or checkboxes that need those things added. You can build that in the software, and in complement to the picture, you will have direct annotation. When Stephen talks an emerging blend, those things will be parameters, which are specific cases which are done when you use the software. So, you see, that's, for example, we don't have time to present OrvView today, but that's the blueprint of the software, which is now the beta version, which Stephen has been using, and he'll show you in a moment when we go together. So you can decide about the doubling. You can have specific parameters. What is it that makes the doubling? Is it for reinforced, for general, selective doubling, intuition, and all those things? You can precise all those elements. Are we dealing with unison? Are we dealing with monochromatic, duochromatic, trichromatic, multichromatic? Are we within across the same family? Are we across sections? So all those things contribute to the type of doubling we're dealing with. So this can be expanded in very different ways. The software looks like that. You can think about things, and automatically those things will be transferred. And connected to our play multi-channel, you can hear anything you set. So that's the action. So going very fast, each user will be able to make a notation directly in LA, refer to a annotation on the online Orchestral database, exchange annotation with colors. One of the most important things I personally am interested in is comparative analysis. We will see Stephen has listed the measure 13 of Schubert as not an emerging. He listed that as an extended ode. I do not agree with that. But the beauty of that is that we have the tool to discuss the reality, not the tool itself. You see, the fact that we make red color or whatever is irrelevant. We have to go past that to really deal with what we perceive really. So my task has been to all the color coding for the grouping effects, all the color coding for the technique and the tools have been defined to be complementary. It can be superposed. It's a daunting task because there's not that very many colors available, so you have to have different shades to make them possible. So then after that, you can search the Orchestral database, compare this is the analysis of Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so. They perceive it that way there in Leipzig. They seem to perceive that like that in New York. Let's see how we perceive things. So if we have common tools and basic inhibition tools, now we can compare what we're dealing with. Same thing as Bill Caplin has done over the years. We have a nomenclature. We know what a pack is, and H half cadence is. All those terms are interesting. We're not discussing what a plagal cadence is. We know it, but we're interested to see how composers use that. So that's what I want to create for those tools. So we don't discuss the color you use, the shapes, but we discuss what is behind them. So I'm going to that. There's a huge, complicated thing how those programs are connected together, how they transfer to database. There's a lot of people involved in all that, but this will be seamless. You push the button, you take that, you have the reference score, and everything goes down. So now, that's the idea here. That's the multi-leg homunculus. So if we're good, we'll have the reference database, we'll have the annotation gene, the play gene, and we can go with many different techniques, functions, ethics, oral phonology, formal analysis, and all those legs will be built in the same structure. You can superpose them, go in and out of many of them. So there are some basic rules. We want to have a clear logical tree structure for each leg. That means we've been discussing the effect team and the technique team about not using the same terms, because that becomes very confusing. For example, the blend is actually the effect of a doubling, can be. So if I use the word blend in my techniques, it'll be very confusing. So the difficulty to have a set of terms which are complementary, which relate to each other, but we do not copy each other. Then to make the best possible use of this structure, have a nomenclature which is specific to the leg. For example, in music history, there are many terms which are not logical. A homophonic texture. This is a very bad misnomer. But everyone knows what the homophonic texture is. Melody, accompaniment, and baseline, basically. So we keep that term, knowing very well that it's not the best possible term. But we can, of course, have a footnote. So again, we should avoid terms for the legs. Each initial tune must be tested, demonstrated in class, of course, and all legs are complementary. So that's very important. So those are all legs which are possible. The structure behind that I'm not going to go into. And there are many other possibilities. We will have soon the possibility to annotate directly on audio files. With Sonogram, those are the two developed by Lasseter-Essen, or phonology. We'll be able to do directly also audio analysis. We've talked of that last week again with our colleagues. And this will be all complementary. So, now, we've seen that. Now let's see a little bit of what this is here. The orchestration technique, I have a few more minutes. Yes. So, again, the idea that we start from the simplest possible thing to things which you can learn, and it becomes a bit more complicated. And as you go, you expand your scope, your perspective. So this is the way it functions. Now, you switch to techniques, and this is what you have. You have an interface to annotate, and if you click for search, the same interface will change to search. That means someone could annotate or search annotation made by other. That's a very simple search system, which has been popularized by the software FileMaker, which makes non-professional searchers able to search in a very complex fashion with very, very simple tools. So that's the idea. So we have the leg, we have the annotation highlight. So for the techniques, we have highlights. For grouping effects, we have boxes. So already it's a difference, and we can superpose them somehow. So otherwise, if we superpose boxes to boxes, we can really understand what might happen. So you have parameters which are there, the fields which are typically field, the nodes, and all those things. So now we have different examples of different versions of the interface. If you use doubling, if you use interplay progression, if you use resonance, so they all. So basically, I'm going to demonstrate the few minutes I have some examples of what you can do and how it can be applied. So now the simplest example is that there's a solo there. Well, that would be a very simple thing. A lot of people in primary school can use that. It's a solo instrument. That's fine. So we can annotate that. We'll be able at some point also with direct data mining to automatize many of those things at some point. So simple interface. Now let's go to layering. It's one of the first things which student orchestration have to deal with. How do we make sense of all the massive sound in front of us? So you have, of course, the idea of foreground, midground, background, but we can have music which have two foregrounds and nothing else than that, or two backgrounds. I've never seen that, but two foregrounds is very common. Or you can have also generic layers. Debussy very often has two layers which are equivalent. You cannot say read it one at a time. Beethoven does that at times also. Two layers are completely equivalent. You cannot say that one to foreground. So you can choose generic or a model. A simple example of that would be, Mozart Symphony here, and this is the foreground is done because of the register. It's done because of the dynamics, because of the fabric. So the type of fabric can be, it's very small here, but it can be a line, it can be a figure, patterns, can be a limited chord. So what is the nature of that layer? So we can go with that. This is all playable. You see that here. So that's an example here, which is slightly more complex, very interesting. So we have this example here. I'm going to play that 1 second because it's one. So that's Mozart, example 3A. Let me see if I can find that. Mozart. Now I have to change to, I'll click on this one. I should get that automatically, more or less. Yes. Piano Concerto Mozart, where are you? Okay. Yeah. So let's listen to that a little bit. Once you buy the idea that the lighter shade is foreground, it's a convention, we certainly have the first volume doing that. But what happens at bar 4? This motive which is just as interesting. So we have very clearly here a second foreground. It's actually really related very much to the first volume. We have this thing, there is some there? We have the accompaniment done by Bouliane on the single ground, and you can deduct that as a bass line going on there. But again, at the very end here, the cadence done by the winds really goes as part of the middle ground. So that picture sorts of gives you an overall idea of what the instruments are doing in a very, very simple way. Is it functioning? Ah, very good, thank you. So when you get to this certainly complementing very, very much what the other one is doing. So let's go to the next one. Now, this is something here which is more sophisticated.
what we have here very clearly, we certainly have this certainly first, second volume, the melody and octave. And now at bar 32, it's second volume, and the first volume recedes to the melody and octave, but gradually will emerge again at the couplet in the next bar. So with this shading, you can see very, very well the role of instruments and how they function. So a simple example here. Now that's the case of Debussy, where we have two foregrounds, the groups of winds, pa-da-pa-pa-dee-pa-pa-pa, and the strings are very, very, very strongly, coupled with the strings system there. And we have the harps, which are somewhere in the middle ground. So we don't have something like a background there, but we have two very clear foregrounds, and you can see that very clearly. So that's a good example of how things can be done. Now, that's a Fabien example here. So all I'm saying here, this is just a description of exactly what it wants, but with the layering tool. The advantage of that is exactly the same thing. There's no difference. The difference is that we have the shades of blue, which are dealing with the layerings, and I replace the virtual layering with composite layering. I believe that, of course, the viola and the cellos are part of one layers. They're virtual, but they're actually composite. So the beauty of that is that you can superpose other analysis of other tools with that, and the blue tells you precisely that you remain there. We can go further. That's an example of Strauss. Actually, a very simple chorale, 3-part, but the instruments change role every bar. So that's quite interesting. Just looking at the picture, you see that's a much complex orchestration. Even the music itself is very simple. That tells you a lot. Now, we go from texture relationships. This is actually a very simple thing. We're talking of chordal texture, interphonic texture, granulation texture, homophonic relationship, polyphonic relationship, polyrhythmic, polymetric, all those things can be defined. So you can go through your scores and see exactly what this is a typical heterophonic texture, instruments which are very close to each other but do something different, which creates a sort of rumbling effect perceptually. So those are the tools which you develop to do that. That's, for example, a granulation texture that you take from Fabien. So this explains exactly what you're doing. In one shot, you look at it. We know we're green, so we know that in texture, we know the layering texture. Blue, it's about the texture themselves. Now it's about how they're made, how they relate to each other. So this is interlocking things, domain. So we have, and now we have to discuss very seriously, Stephen and I and all our teams, we use fused, which means emergent. So whether we consider fusing doubling as a technique or as a perceptual effect, I think we'll have to discuss. I'll leave probably that to you at some point. But nevertheless, we can analyze that. But we have here the possibility of chroma, different type of chroma. So you can use two for example, you can have unichroma, that would be doubling by two or more same instruments, or monochroma by similar timbres. For example, if you have a sustained sound, high G on the flute or the vibrato, or harmonic and violin, if you cut the attack, the sound is extremely similar. It's the same chroma. So then you can have also dual chroma, trichroma. After trichroma, I don't count. I say polychroma. That's probably complex enough in my ears. But you can do that way. And coupling is the same side of the coin, except that we defined it, and you'll see why in examples at different pitch classes working together. This could go up to a complete mixture also of instruments. This is where we meet very precisely. So that a clear example of here, this bit on P, you have the monochroma within family, and it's used for timbral quality. Why is the violin, why is the cello, the viola doubling? It brings a very different type of sonority than just only the viola or just only the violin. So it's not for reinforcement the word piano, it's for a timbral transformation. So that's a good example of that. That we have the example of violins here. So we have here typical chroma, polychroma across family. So you see the other instruments here. So this is how they relate together. We could consider all those things. Now we have things very interesting here. if you look carefully, you have different layers. You have this beautiful doubling of the clarinet, the bassoon, the trumpet, and the cello. This is unique. But we also have the punctuation done by the horns, the timpani, and the harp. So that's very, very interesting. Right away, you see how things are combined together in a snap. We know they're in orange, we know that we need the doubling effect, blue near to layering, green with relationships. The same colors apply for Stephen also thing, which we didn't discuss in detail, but it's the same type of relationships. So that's our famous example as we have here. So we consider this one as a timbral chroma, dual chroma across family. So that's very precise. And this chromatic kit comes from
Gardner Reed.
for Gardner Reed, exactly. So this is something which we integrated and adapted, which actually becomes very, very handy because it's a more precise approach to doubling.
Yeah, meeting me and you, and we talked about changing fuse to fusion, and
Yes. Yes, because fuse is a result of the
separation.
Absolutely right. I agree completely. So, we're in the process of defining hundreds of terms and trying to make them unique to each leg. So, you're absolutely right. I agree completely. Fuse is the result. Fusion is the action. We should change that, and we shall. So, I could play all the things. This is something which is very interesting also here. Now, we have here, this is the beautiful solo horn. But of course, we have a very bright horn. If you listen to orchestra, everyone says, what a beautiful horn, what clear, high timbre. Well, it's double two octaves with the word flute. So this is a case where we will have here primary instruments and now alternating instruments. So you see right away how this functions. You can see that. Now, that's an interesting case which speaks for, Kit and I do not agree completely on that, but we will at some point, about doubling and coupling. Janacek used that very precisely. The first part is actually coupling, so they're parallel intervals and harmonic, and the other one in pale is coupling, unisono. So that makes, it used that systematically in the fanfare of the Sinfonietta. So that's a very good example of how the color, you see just like that. By the way, many of those analyses have been done by my students, and I integrated them in our work here. But this is a very clear analysis of actually how coupling and doubling are different and used compositionally very clearly. So now we go into something which is even more interesting. This is a very simple, so it's just a hybrid. You think it's a melody symphony, yes. But if you look carefully, you will have the melody. Let's forget that it's doubled by the flute for timbral quality. Now the coupling enters right here. And now we have the doubling of the coupling. So there's no dynamic change, there's no nothing, but the music will just grow, will get thicker, and it will just recede. So with that, you have the picture. You can see exactly what's going on, and you understand visually what is actually getting done. So we can go Bruckner, we can go much further here. Now we get to interplane progression. Now we are having this shade of green and lilac and pink. So this gets a bit more complicated. Variation, contrast, transformation, specific case of transform melody. We go to thickening, thinning out, orchestral crescendo, climax, and harmonization. I would agree that climax and harmonization are very generic. But if you look at most orchestral treatises, there's almost a chapter in that. So we have to deal with that somehow, and that's what we did with that. So that's a clear example. That's Tchaikovsky. Let me just find you that here. Such a good example. What are the examples? Number one, 17A. I'll just play you that here. If I can find it. So little time. Yeah, so we're going to hear the examples. So that's dovetailing. Okay, but now you can segment the dovetailing that way. Now just the winds. And now just the brasses, if you can find the button. Yep. Okay. And together. So that's a clear thing. All those examples are multi-channel in Orca. You can listen to them and check them as they go. So let's go a bit further here. Now we have a clear case of variation. So there's one element, a little motive, which is played between, and it varies. So
again, we are in the realm of those type of colors. And when you see those type of colors, we already know that way to interpret progression. So that's the beauty of that. We can play all those things. They're all very... Now, we have an example here, Bill, which I don't have time to go into, but we have a case where the orchestration doesn't follow the phrase structure. And this gets very, very interesting. Actually, there's actually more segments orchestration-wise than musically. And that's the difference between Mozart and Haydn. Haydn, most of the time, not always, but the orchestration will very much follow the structure of the phrase, but Mozart not necessarily. That's a clear example where there's a variation of timbre within the phrase structure. It's quite interesting. If we superpose your leg on top of that bill at some point, we'll be able to see where the phrase structure is and how the orchestration vary or depart from that or copies that. So that's the future. Other examples also here. Another case, your example here, we have many more colors than definition of the phrase structure itself. Quite interesting. Let's go further. Now you see all of a sudden here how those things vary. On top of that, you have the green going to darker, which is an orchestral build-up. So any student orchestra will look at that, even if you don't listen to the music, sort of imagine what's going to come from that, because the picture, I hope, is rather clear. So this is another example of something fabulous here. We have a written out thinning out. This is fabulous because you have less and less and less instruments, and things disappear on there. So that's the thinning out principle. You can see it very precisely. The global orchestration decrescendo. And if you go for resonance, manipulation of timbre, we have sustaining instruments, the one being sustained. We have the bounding effect, which is your sauce, basically, which is a very important thing. Yeah, 2 minutes, thank you. Fusing roll. Fusing roll, it sounds like a simple thing, but a very simple example, a big cymbal clash. The harmonic spectrum is made to fuse everything which is playing. This is why when you get in the Schubert and you go, it's so strong that the color, especially if you get, when you go a bit higher, so it gets so strong that the global sonority, it's difficult to differentiate. If you add the timpani on that, boom, then of course it's going to blend tremendously. Cymbal, even more of that. Spectral alteration, we don't have time to go there here. But now, this is a clear example of sustain. If you play that with that symphony, just the string. If you give me 1 minute, I'll play that example, and we might be able to stop there. So that's Mozart 48, example 24A. If I find that. Where's my mouse? Mozart 24A. Yeah, okay, so that's the whole thing. Okay, now let's check what happens if you have only the violins. Fine? Okay, now let's have the violin plus oboe 1 and 2. So it's like you play on the piano and you're going to the bell here. Whoa. You see, you sort of, I don't know, the sounds are changed that way. You actually some pedals of notes. The same thing, the viola is doubled by the bassoons also there. So that's a huge difference. You can hear what the viola do. But of course, if you put the bassoon with them, you're into a very different world. The world is expanded. The space of the music also is growing. This is quite fabulous orchestration. Listen to the viola and bassoon. So this is quite fabulous. Okay, another example there. This is even more interesting. I'm going to jump to the very end now because we have very obviously this music, but there is this harmonic strumming, okay, which is done by first and second violin. But if you do that alone, it's not going to blend in a figurative use of the word. Now the two flutes are there to sustain some of the notes, and they make all that blend perfectly well. So you can also go a bit further, and I'm going to go straight to superposition of examples here. We'll get straight to the end here.
Now, let's take that example. I'll stop right there. It should come right away. Hopefully. Yeah. So this is the analysis of those few bars of the Brahms from the layer perspective. Very obviously, those violin and the flutes are part of the layer. One is steadily sustaining certain notes of the other, but you can also superpose the doubling. If you put them together, this is what you get. If you have to find your color, they're transparent. We could also superpose Stevens' perceptual analysis on top of that. I think you understand the power of that tool because it's been systematized. There's a code of color. Now, what interests me is not so much the code of color, which took years to do, but actually to hear how you perceive those things, and with the same tools, how would you analyze those things? So if we have a common structure, I'm finished, we'll be able to discuss about what we really believe piece is about and how we perceive it. So that's what I wanted to show you today. Many thanks for your attention. It's very short, and I'll show you in Schubert how those tools can be used to analyze the music. Thank you very much.